Our first attribute for our students is adaptability. Simply put, we want our students to both accept and thrive in a changing world.
One of the things is that the landscape is changing, and as the landscape changes, we have to make sure that we are preparing ourselves and our students for what is out there.
I think that adaptability is so spot on, especially for this exact situation.
We have thought about what is the future of our kids? What is the future of work? What is the future that we need to prepare them for? Well, guess what? That future just met us right now.
When the pandemic hit, our kids had to pivot immediately. They showed incredible resilience and embodied this attribute so well. Learning takes effort, and online learning requires focus and dedication.
So it made me challenge myself and, go outside of my box and be more creative in my way of learning.
I would argue that our kids have always been adapting.
They just know how to be a little bit more flexible. Just because of how rapid things change.
Whether it's new leadership, a new principal, you get a new teacher, particularly when you get in middle school and high school, every year your teachers look different. You are adapting and we don't even know that we're adapting.
I don't want to be the same person I am 2 weeks from now. I want to be better. I want to better myself every day.
You'll be working on something and the priority shifts, you're asked to work on something else. And if you don't have these adaptability skills, it's going to be hard for you to move from one to another quickly.
You can kind of change your course without negatively impacting the outcome. So you'll still get the desired outcome that you wanted, but you might just get there a different way.
And we find that that's the most compelling part of this work is how do we equip them to thrive in that rapidly changing and very complex world.
Accepting and valuing those who are different from us is at the core of global empathy.
Global empathy was something big that I learned from Columbus North International High School. It's a school where there's literally represents over 20 different countries. So many different languages are spoken at that school.
And it's very normal for me to see a kid say, hola, and then ni hao. I think that's one of the most beautiful things. We don't feel different, we feel unique. The difference is it became an asset. It's not like something we have to hide.
Columbus City Schools, I think as an organization, really allows for an unprecedented level of multicultural exposure, more than our surrounding district counterparts. We are so diverse here.
We serve lots of economic levels, so it's a multifaceted district.
And our kids see things differently. They're incredibly diverse, right? Much more acceptance of people who aren't like them, whether it be sexual orientation or race or gender identity.
If you haven't guessed by now, we see our diversity as one of our biggest strengths.
In order for us to fully realize that as a strength, we also have to be curious about one another's perspectives, life experiences, and the assets they bring to the table.
You should be there for your fellow human. And I think that it's important to teach kids that as young as we can.
I like my friends because they share. And by my friends is I don't want to make them angry or sad. I just want to cheer them up and make them happy.
Different people doesn't mean different things. Like, say a person's lighter than you. What does that mean?
You meet so many new people, different people. You get to know all these different cultures because you meet friends from countries you've never even heard from.
The world is bigger than just ourselves.
If you think of the world as all just one skin color, one religion, one culture, it's gonna be more boring because you're not gonna understand how other people feel.
The ability to be able to disagree and to be able to articulate your opinions and perspectives without being, confrontational necessarily, but also listening to one another.
Accepting and valuing those who are different from us is at the core of global empathy. It's about taking action to celebrate and protect our differences.
They are our leaders right now. They are pushing us to be better and to think better as grown-ups. And that's exactly what we need and what we're looking for.
The death of George Floyd, added an additional layer that we have kind of swept under the rug for a long time, and that's around inequity and racism.
Our students were a vital part of helping our entire community know that there were things that we just can't tolerate as citizens. And we want our students to be change agents, and they really showed us that they could be. And I think we're very proud of that as a district, to know that our students are willing and able to stand up for the things that they know are right.
This is the place where I live too. We always want to make the world a better place, so why not start now instead of waiting until it's too late?
We have to continue to march, continue to protest, continue to converse.
Good evening, everyone. I am calling our October 25th special board meeting to order. This is replacing our regular meeting that was scheduled last week, and so we moved it to this date, so it is now a special meeting. Please call the roll.
President Adair.
Present.
Ms. Beckerly.
Present.
Mr. Brown.
Here.
Mr. Cole. Dr. Pierce.
Present.
Vice President Reyes.
Here.
Ms. Vera.
Here.
You have a quorum, Madam President.
Thank you very much. Will you please stand and join me in the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, board members, on our agenda this evening, we have no public comment on agenda items. We are doing a monitoring report with our superintendent on Goal 2. We are expecting an executive report from our internal auditor and a report on the 5-year forecast from our treasurer. We do not have any items on board matters, but I would like to propose an amendment to add a 7.1. Board Member Brown would like to update us on the voucher litigation that we are part of. We have our consent agenda this evening. We have some speakers who are here to talk with us on non-agenda items, and then we will have executive session and then return to adjourn. So with the addition of item 7.1, which is to discuss the litigation that we are in, an update on that, is there a motion?
Motion to approve the agenda with the addition of the item for 7.1.
Second.
Been a motion and a second. Are there any other requests to add anything to the agenda? Seeing none and without objection, the agenda has been approved. All right, let's go ahead and move into item 4, our superintendent executive report. Madam Superintendent, good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, President Adair. Good evening, everyone. Tonight I have with me Chief Performance Officer, Dr. Russell Brown, Chief Transformation and Leadership Officer, Dr. Angela Chapman, and Chief Equity Officer, Dr. Dion Blue, and Chief Curriculum Officer, Dr. Todd Walker. And together we will collaboratively provide a monitoring report on Board Goal 2, Closing Opportunity Gaps. Within this goal, it is stated that the percentage of 4-year graduation cohort students who complete state and district graduation requirements will increase from 81.4% in August 2020, or a decline in the benchmark due to COVID, to 86% in August 2026. So now we'll hand it over to start the presentation. We'll hand it over to Dr. Brown to get us started. Dr. Brown.
Good evening, President Adair, Vice President Reyes, members of the board and community. Pleased to join you this evening to be able to give an update on the Board Goal 2, Closing Opportunity Gaps. Today I want to really go through 3 things prior to our dialogue. One, how did our students' performance compare to other large urban systems around the state? And that's looking at last year's report card. This is a follow-up for the conversation that we had earlier. We had a fall data report that we provided to the board that was before the report card came out, and want to come back and talk about what we know about the other urbans following the return to in-person instruction in the pandemic. I want to talk about this past year's cohort and how they did vis-a-vis the board goal, and then what strategies that are in place for our students and those that are being put in place for our students as we move forward, which emanated out of our work last year when we talked about the interim goals and how we saw our cohorts 9th, 10th, and 11th grade last year and where they were in some of the strategies that we introduced in May that we talked about putting in place for this year as we move forward, in the context of that as we move forward. So again, we just had a report card come out recently, and our graduation rate last year was 79.7%. That was the class of 21 that showed up on this report card. It's the second highest rate of the larger urban systems. And it's higher than that of Cincinnati and Cleveland, which are the most similar to us. Every large system around the state lost ground during the pandemic. And I think it's important to acknowledge that that our system didn't lose as much ground as the majority of the systems around the state. And in fact, if you look at Cincinnati and Cleveland in particular, which are most similar to us, their losses during the pandemic were substantially larger than ours. Our graduation rate, again, amongst the large urban systems, is the second highest graduation rate. It was one of the most stable graduation rates during the pandemic and the return to in-person instruction. I think that's important to acknowledge because the pandemic, and for those of you that have been following this week, the release from the National Center of Educational Statistics was sobering and pointed out the dramatic losses in instruction and academic achievement across the entire country and even within the state of Ohio as well. And for us to be able to hold our own and for our students to be relatively stable during this window of time, I think is really truly a success. And the idea of them moving forward and looking how we maintain this and accelerate achievement for our students and graduation rates for our students moving forward is really important. So carrying forward, what can we anticipate on the next report card? So as the superintendent articulated, the board goal is a goal for the overall graduation rate. It's not one that speaks to equity in terms of different student groups based on race or different student groups based on service. It's an overall grad rate. And while other systems have looked at race-based graduation goals or race-based targets, at this point in time, given some of the challenges that we see, we have some global challenges with our student population. So I think a global goal actually makes a lot of sense and allows us to lean in and try to create change for our students. And as we learn and as we refine, as we iterate and have continuous improvement, I think we will naturally begin to focus on the needs of subgroups in that population. Our preliminary grad rate right now is 79.6. It's actually identical to what it was last year. There's still a little wiggle room in this. It's preliminary. So last year at this time it was 79.6. It went up to 79.7. There's still a little accounting piece that goes back and forth on this. We are effectively flat from where we were last year. At this time, we're meeting our board goal, and we're on target still to meet our long-term goal overall. Again, quite impressive given the losses that we've seen around the state in comparably sized districts. And again, what we heard from NCES, what we heard tied to the NAEP data, was systems like ours, students like ours, high poverty rates, lower academic achievement coming into the pandemic, they suffered the most. They saw the most losses in achievement across the country. And this is, again, a pattern that we've seen time and time again, but reaffirmed with NAEP, which is really the gold standard for comparison across the country. There's some celebrations in this data. I think we often focus on areas that are behind, but there's some real celebrations here. Our Asian Pacific Islander students are actually exceeding our final board goal. They're where we want our system to be in 2026. Our African American students are exceeding our 2025 goal. It is really fairly unusual in a large urban system to see African American students outperforming white students. We have an inversion here. Our African American students are one of our highest performing groups in this system. That's something to celebrate and something we should be proud of. Our multiracial students also exceeded this goal. And again, we don't have any racially specific strategies out there, but right now, this is what we're doing is largely working for these student groups. And then, although our English learners aren't meeting the goal, and I'd like to point out that, if you look at this data, I tried to provide a lot more history than we have in the past. English learners have struggled all the way along, but we see this upward trajectory. There's something to learn there. Our team that's been working with English learners has done some really good work. And we've seen, last year we saw some spillover to our Hispanic population. This year we didn't see quite as much of that. But I think there's something, again, to be celebrated there and something to be learned there. There's some areas for improvement. We get some questions around this. There's some clear areas for improvement here. Hispanic and white students' graduation rates have been lower over time than their black and multiracial counterparts across the system. We've seen that, and we see that also centered in our West Side schools. So we saw that at Briggs, we see it at West, and those student populations are overrepresented in the West Side schools, West and Briggs both. And so there's a sort of a overlap between those two things. Clearly, when we think about the impact of the pandemic, homeless students were incredibly vulnerable, and it became much harder to provide services and access them. And another thing to sort of emphasize with respect to grad rate, in effect, when you get to the fourth year, grad rate's almost baked in at that point. There are things that are already limiting your grad rate when you enter the senior year if they haven't been taken care of along the way. So part of the genius, I think, of the board having interim goals that focus on where's 9th grade, where's 10th grade, where's that cohort as it moves through, because if we don't intervene in 9th grade, it gets harder and harder and harder as we go along. So we need to keep those kids engaged, we need to keep them on track as we move through with them. Special education students were also very vulnerable during the pandemic and disproportionately impacted across. And again, we had this particular year, we had a larger number of special ed dropouts than in the past. Again, an area that we need to lean in, but we already have strategies in place to begin to lean into that. There are also some things that frankly happened on the back end in terms of data and some changes in rules with ODE that may have influenced or decreased that a little bit as well. So there's a little noise in that. So finally, when we were coming here last year, when we talked about interim goals, particularly what we talked about for 10th and 11th grade, there were some things that we went out in the world and we listened to our schools. We visited schools that were doing very well, schools that had lower graduation rates or on-time rates, and schools that were in the middle. And we heard very loud and clear that climate was a real issue for our schools, that coming out of the pandemic, our kids were coming back with far more needs than what folks were used to seeing. And that was part of why we leaned into this work around, again, school climate and attendance. Some of our schools in this set had chronic absenteeism rates that were extraordinarily high. We know that the most important thing that we have is instructional time. If we want our kids to be successful, they have to be in front of their teachers. They have to have learning opportunities. And we have to lean into creating change. Both school climate and school attendance are not small things to change. They are not things that change quickly. They are adaptive changes, and it's a change of the culture, not just within our schools, but within our community writ large. And this is something that we're going to have to lean into over time to create change with. Again, we elevated those last year in May, and we're beginning to lean into that work right now. We have a guardrail around MTSS, and we're implementing MTSS and really robustly beginning to implement that this year. I'm pleased to say that this week I've been collaborating with my colleagues from curriculum, from equity, from school leadership and transformation. We've had so far this week, we've had all our elementary principals with a coach in this building. And we've led them through a process to align their school improvement plans to the MTSS model. We're going to do the same thing with our middle schools. We're going to do the same thing with our high schools. It is clearly a strategy intended to differentiate instruction and provide support to our students, our most needy students. And then finally, one of the things that we're going to be pushing on and continue to push on is early intervention. Again, for me, one of the things, the most important things is maintaining hope for kids. If I get really far off track and I don't work to try to, if I'm not engaged in working to get on track until my senior year, and I have lots and lots of credits, that's an overwhelming mountain for kids to climb sometimes. So the earlier we intervene, the easier it is to maintain hope and keep kids engaged with the work moving forward. So early intervention, so we're starting to look at, hey, end of first quarter, who's getting Fs? Let's not wait until somebody fails a semester. Let's intervene ahead of time. Let's start trying to get kids back on track. And if kids fall off and need to do credit recovery, let's get them in credit recovery as early as possible. So these strategies, the three strategies I talked about, attendance, school climate, credit recovery, and keeping kids on track, all align to things that we talked about in the spring. They're a continuation of that work. And obviously the MTS model is part of what we talked about as a board guardrail. It's one of the things that you anticipate us to do and is being woven into that work as we move forward. With that, I think we're ready to begin our dialogue.
Okay. So before we can begin questions, we start with our monitoring review, and we have to answer these questions as a board. Looking at the monitoring report that we received, does the report clearly show what is being monitored, board members? I'm seeing head nods, yes. Does it clearly show data for the 3 previous reporting periods? Yes. Does it clearly show the current reporting period? Yes. Does it clearly show the target reporting periods, annual targets and deadline target? Yes. 3, does it clearly show the superintendent's evaluation of the performance? Yes. And number 4, does it clearly show supporting documentation that evidences the superintendent evaluation if the district is not on target or the superintendent's evaluation indicates implementation is not on track? Does the monitoring report clearly describe any needed next steps? We are on track for this one, so that last question is not there. All right, so we can go ahead and do the monitoring this evening. I just want to call attention in your folders, board members. There's the questions that were previously asked with the answers. We have agreed that we will attempt to spend 2/3 of our time on the who, what, why questions and 1/3 of our time on the how questions. I will track the time. Any board member like to begin with their questions? Oh, sorry, board member Beckerly.
You know, I'm looking at the strategies, implementation of MTSS, school climate and attendance, and early intervention. And I'm wondering, do we have any evidence, any correlations between these strategies and improved outcomes, or is it too soon?
I think it's too soon. What we do know is that attendance is clearly related to outcome. We know that there's a correlation between students' attendance and their outcomes. Pick your variable.
Do we know that from our own data or from research?
From our own data. I presented last year with our monitoring reports and sort of broken out that once kids get past about 20% absenteeism rate, their probability of being able to graduate plummets.
All right.
So it is something that we have to really lean into. And again, deeply related to school climate and academic outcomes are tied to school climate as well.
And can I ask another question? What might, I loved the, well, I'm not supposed to comment, right? I'm just gonna ask a question. In the training you described that you had the elementary schools here and they're being taught or, I guess, instructed or how to align the school improvement plan to MTSS. Just an example of what that might look like that's different than either what they've done before or how that looks in practice, like if you can pick a metric or an example, or if a school needs to improve. Well, let's say a school needs to improve on graduation rate. How would that translate into an MTSS-aligned school improvement plan?
Wait a minute.
No?
Try again.
Okay. You shared that part of the process for implementing MTSS that you were making sure school improvement plans were aligned to this model. And I'm wondering what that looks like. Maybe that's just the question. And maybe it's too complicated. I don't know.
No, I don't think it is.
Okay.
So obviously, when you think about MTSS, and I'm going to actually defer to Dr. Walker here in a moment because this is not my area of specialty as much as his. But when I think about MTSS, it's really about trying to differentiate support for students and thinking about Tier 1 instructional needs. And what does it mean to improve Tier 1 instruction? First instruction for our students. That is our primary goal. So our schools were one, they were given some orientation from a member of Dr. Walker's team, Dr. Nelson, came in to sort of again, reinforce some ideas around MTSS, what it looks like. It's a continuation of ongoing PD that has been provided to our schools. We then ask schools to go off and analyze data to identify by school what is their biggest tier 1 gap, and then begin to create a theory of action around what they, root cause analysis, theory of action. And then we coupled that with members of Dr. Walker's team, members of Dr. Blue's team, and under the guidance and supervision of Dr. Chapman's team, to have them revisit then what resources are available through central office to help support that work and move forward with that. And then at the end of the day, so we did that for tier 1, then we came back and said, okay, what group of students at your school is furthest behind? What are you going to do over and above? How do you differentiate time? How do you differentiate resources for that group of students? Again, based on data. So that doesn't look the same for every building. It's differentiated by building based on their current data that they just administered from iReady, looking into that. We had the iReady team here to help support people in that work. So some folks are not as familiar as others. We wanted to scaffold and support that. And then at the end of the day, all of that was intended for them to funnel into modification of their school improvement plan to align to an MTSS model. So we're taking that school improvement plan and moving it into a dynamic document. We're emphasizing with our schools that we're all learning. This is a learning process. We keep hammering the idea that, student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change, and adult behavior change is learning. We're all learning. So we expect that we will learn from our schools, and we'll be able to elevate good practices. So it's not just a top-down model, but also a bottom-up. And yes, we'll apply the same to high school.
Thank you.
Additional who, what, why questions? From Rivera.
Thank you, President Adair. Do we know why we're seeing a significant dropout rate in special education?
I don't have a good answer for that. We haven't dug into that as much as we could. I do think that there's room here for some additional learning on our behalf to try to understand. I do believe that the strategy around MTSS works to get ahead of that, but I do think there's something to be learned from what happened.
And I guess my follow-up question to that is, do we know what grade levels have been impacted the most by this special education dropout rates? Are we seeing that mostly in 9th, 10th, 11th? Do we know that?
So while I know that the dropout rate was a little higher this year, I did not disaggregate it by year, so I can't tell you whether or not the majority of those folks left in 9th grade or left in 12th grade. That I don't have off the cuff.
Okay.
It is an important thing to point out because sometimes students leave us in 9th grade, they withdraw and they leave the system. That counts against our grad rate. So when students withdraw and don't engage in another system, that counts against us. They stay in the denominator. They don't come out of that. So again, trying to engage students earlier and trying to get kids back in as early as possible becomes incredibly important if we're trying to, again, to maintain hope and move them forward. It's something that, again, the movement to looking at cohort, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, encourages schools to look at that in a more timely fashion and try to intervene with that ahead of time. Because again, if we wait till 12th grade, it's baked in.
No, I agree. And so I guess that leads me to, so what is the process then for the early intervention? I earlier on you mentioned, credit recovery, things of that nature, but specifically kind of tying into our special education population or just our students as a whole, like what is outside of just that? What else is part of that process for early intervention?
About the early intervention for high school students. So we are empowering all of our high school teams to follow the cohort as a whole. And so certainly in order for us to improve our graduation rate, we have to make sure that we're looking and monitoring, supporting the ninth grade cohort. Most of our students, you know, that's where they get off track in ninth grade. And so all of our high schools have established a team that meets weekly, regularly to monitor the ninth grade cohort, the 10th grade cohort, the 11th grade cohort, and the 12th grade cohort. This team is not just meeting to look at the data, but they're looking at the data in real time to determine what interventions are needed for the students. Perhaps they need to be partnered with the social worker, perhaps they need support with attendance, perhaps they're having challenges with transportation. Perhaps the challenges are focused on academics. They're looking at what courses they're failing. They are determining, connecting with the teacher to determine additional opportunities that are needed for that student. So they're looking at the cohort as a whole, but they are drilling down student by student, grade by grade, to understand what the challenges are. And this is a team that comprises, in most schools, it would comprise the administrator will be, for example, at a high school, you'll have an AP that's supporting primarily the ninth grade cohort. You'll have a counselor that's supporting the ninth grade cohort. You'll have social worker support. You'll have the senior advisor if it's the senior team. But every team, every high school is empowering a team. We're practicing distributive leadership and creating that collective responsibility so that every school is looking at the needs of all of their students. And that early intervention, we say that, we're saying we're intervening before they fail. These meetings have been going on since the beginning of the school year. They're not starting those meetings after the end of the first quarter, after we've received our grades. They're not waiting until the students are in 10th grade or 11th grade. They're having these conversations on a regular basis in real time. As Dr. Brown mentioned, the school improvement process, all of our high schools have an area of focus on matriculation. And a part of that area of focus in their school improvement plan, they're looking at the data school-wide to determine what mid-course corrections that they need to make throughout the year. And this week, we're bringing in the high school principals. I believe they're coming in on Thursday of this week. But they'll also be empowered and connected with the resources of the district. So perhaps you need more support from PBIS, social emotional learning, attendance, leadership. No matter whatever those needs are, we'll have everyone here in one place, so you don't have to hunt and search for those resources. You don't have to email anyone. Everyone is here readily available to lean in and support those conversations. Some of our schools are thinking about how to provide more opportunities in school for credit recovery, and so they're building in resources and time for after-school programming for credit recovery options. They're finding if they keep the kids at school, they're more engaged, they're more likely to attend, and they have the support from their teacher right there on site. So those are some of the steps that we're taking collectively as a district, school by school, team by team, grade by grade, to really understand the data, to understand what the needs are, and then develop plans in response to that data.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I guess my final question for that process then is, what is the communication strategy for involving parents in that process? Because I just want to understand, how are we communicating to families where their kids are at prior to the report cards coming out, or closer to graduation? What is the communication strategy to keep parents abreast of what their students are doing or needing as additional services?
Great question. So all of our students have a course planner, and so this planner lists all of the courses, depending on the pathway that the students are on, that they need to accomplish before they graduate. And so the senior counselors for our seniors, the counselors are meeting with the students and their parents to help them understand this is your plan, this whether you're on track, off track, and this is what we're going to do about it. But we have opportunities along the way, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, to have grade level meetings, cohort meetings, as well as individual one-on-one conversations with families to understand where their students are on that journey, in addition to our traditional report cards and parent-teacher conferences and so forth.
Thank you.
Vice President Reyes.
Thank you. Kind of along the same question. What parent strategies can we look at that can help promote attendance and improved culture?
Did you say parent strategies?
What parent strategies?
So, wait, before you answer, are you asking?
She was talking about how are we reaching out to our parents.
Are you? My question was going to be: are you asking about what we're doing now, or in the future, which would be the next series of questions?
You said who, what, and why.
Who? Right, but you're saying. I'm asking: is your question about what we plan to do,
now,
or what are we doing?
What are we doing now? What parent strategies, right now, are we using that promote attendance and improved culture?
I think the number one strategy that we're thinking about as it relates to attendance is making sure that parents know how many days that their students have missed. Sometimes parents do not receive the alerts that in Infinite Campus. No, I receive them, but we need to make sure that we close the gap. And so we have partnered with a partner that is going to help us lift up the communication between school and families to make sure that they know when their child is absent, how many days they have been absent, and how to re-engage to get their students back on track. In addition to that, all of our schools have an attendance team that meets regularly, and a key function of that attendance team is ensuring that there's crystal clear communication between the school and the families, not only to flag that their child is absent or there's an attendance concern, but to really figure out what are the challenges and to get at the root causes of why the child is absent. Perhaps there are resources that we can connect the family with. Perhaps there are barriers that we can remove so that the child can return to school and decrease the number of absences that they're seeing if there's a pattern. And then as it relates to culture, certainly our schools are focusing on providing their parents with providing all families with opportunities to be engaged in school, whether that is attending school events. All of our schools have a family ambassador that serves as that thread to help connect the families to the school, but they are promoting all of the events in the school, building relationships with parents, making sure that they're receiving the messages that are going out through multiple mediums, whether it's email, phone, one-on-one. I know our family ambassadors are also supporting with check and connect calls just to check in and say, how are things going? What else do you need? In addition, right now, this week, we are asking all families to complete the Panorama survey, which gives us feedback on the communication from each school individually, as well as the communication from their classroom teacher. So this survey, the window is still open right now, and all families should be receiving text messages and robocalls inviting them to participate in our Panorama survey, which gives us valuable feedback on what we need to tweak, modify, or reinforce as it relates to parent engagement. And then there's also a student survey, as you know, as well as a staff survey. So shameless plug that we would like all of our CCS community to complete the Panorama survey, and we really do look at that feedback and use it to guide our work and our next steps as a district, as well as each school community.
Thank you. What is our data stating is the reason people are dropping out of Columbus City Schools?
I can share what I've heard from our principals, our school teams, and our school counselors. What I have heard in talking with our senior teams or our principals, our school counselors, is that our families have students that have challenges with attendance, challenges with in their home environment. In many cases, some students are choosing to go to work for a variety of reasons and deprioritizing school. And so there are some real conversations about how to keep our kids engaged in school and work on the weekends or after school, outside of school time. So what I've heard are there have been some really significant challenges as it relates to keeping kids engaged. There have been some schools have shared that they are working on creating helping kids feel more connected to school. During the pandemic, students felt more disconnected from school, and so our kids who were already teetering on disengagement, the pandemic certainly did not help with that, and so they are really thinking about it's our students right now who are chronically absent. That data is a huge indicator of students who are disengaged and become further disengaged. So finding creative ways to keep our kids, to turn around that pattern and keep them more engaged. But there are some significant challenges, and I can't say that they're all bucketed in one bucket, but I can certainly know that our principals and our school teams, they get to know the students and they know their challenges. If we invited one of our social workers to a board meeting, they would be able to speak in great depth about the challenges that some of our students are experiencing and the barriers that they are working with them to overcome so that they can stay engaged and stay in school.
Thank you. What impact was, what was the impact of our decision to be virtual during COVID have on our dropout rates? Do we know that?
Oh, that's a heavy question. I don't think we can quantify that.
I think we have a way to get at that numeric way.
And I because it kind of came from your anecdotal, right? We were anecdotally hearing that some folks left because they're working. Anecdotally, some of us heard, well, if I want to play football and we're not in person, I'm going to X school. And then later I'll ask, what are we doing to get them back? But
yeah, but for this cohort of students, they had 2 years of high school remote. So it had to have a negative impact on them. Student engagement becomes much more difficult under those circumstances. I think we've all seen, Zoom classrooms where, the what I call the Hollywood squares are all blacked out, and there's disengagement. I don't think anyone believes that was an ideal way to educate students, and we're all still dealing with the consequences of that, including with this cohort now who spent 2 years in that as well. It's going to take a couple years to get out from under that.
what tools do we have to track where our students went?
What tools are we currently using?
Yeah.
If a student enrolls in another system, we know that. Unfortunately, some of our students withdraw and don't tell us where they're going. And that, again, I think the emphasis on trying to focus on the cohort starting in 9th grade and tracking along the way, the sooner we engage, the more likely it is we gather that information and have a way to connect. What we're talking about here is relationship,
right.
Building relationship with students. That's the bottom line.
And currently, school social workers are the point persons. When students are chronically absent, they follow up and they're making the calls. And whenever possible, they try to put notes into Infinite Campus to determine what the cause. Sometimes they're not able to locate where the students are. but they typically are the point persons on those teams that are trying to ascertain where students have gone.
My last question, kind of still a follow-up. What partner strategies have we explored that can assist us?
With tracking.
I'm sorry. What partner strategies have we explored that are currently working to help us with your, with the deficits that you're seeing, that it's attendance and school climate?
You're asking what partnerships we have?
What partner strategies? Now, I
Partner
kind of know what the
strategies.
partners are,
Well,
kind of.
Well, one of our larger partners, the strategies that we're using are to, like Dr. Chapman mentioned, making calls home to kind of find out what are some of the reasons students aren't engaged, and then really trying to do a deeper root cause, like sending information back to the school to say these are the list of students who are chronically absent. These are some of the reasons that they are chronically absent, so that schools can kind of do what Dr. Walker and Dr. Chapman already mentioned in terms of the wraparound. One of the other things that I think would be very beneficial for us is the strategy of working with CASEL to think about what is our social emotional learning, kind of a district-wide strategy around re-engaging students and really making that connection based on the impact, you know, kind of to your question, the impact of the pandemic, the things that are going on in the community kind of in general. Because we do have some really good strategies and kind of pockets of things going on in terms of support for students, but really streamlining that in a way that helps us to be more focused in our support for students, which is kind of where the MTSS piece comes in. So I think it's really in terms of a strategy about how do we put all the resources together and focus them in a way that really can support students the best.
A few other partnerships that I can think of to build on what Dr. Blue shared. Of our bigger partnerships, as you know about City Year. City Year provides mentoring and support in many of our schools. They are in several of our high schools. Communities in Schools provides the Communities in Schools social worker and support. Again, supporting in many of our high schools. They're part of those that senior teams and those cohort meetings. I Know I Can, you know, they have their I Know I Can CAMs that provide support to our seniors and our senior teams. They usually have a seat on that senior team. And then we have several schools that are working to provide after-school programming to keep our kids engaged, keep them at school. And then we also have several schools that are partnering with local agencies to provide mentoring and increase their capacity to provide that one-on-one support or additional mentoring to students who may need it.
The reason I asked that question, and maybe I need help eventually, we just did the big table in the community, and many of us attended many tables. And I heard in various rooms, this organization works with African girls from Africa. This organization works with girls. This organization works with Black and Latino girls. This organization works with girls. So there was, that's why I'm asking if you can help me with the question. Okay. So that's what I'm asking about from our strategies. If I'm sitting at a big table where I have 10 organizations working with girls in the same area, what's our strategy to bring them together? They all kind of said similar things, that they're working with social emotional, they're helping with mentoring. So so my question as I sat at the big table is and they're all in Columbus City Schools, what are our strategies to bring these cohorts together, all these organizations, and help us meet the end goal? And I don't necessarily need an answer today, but that's what I'm trying to get at when I say, what is our strategy to bring these partnerships together to help us achieve the goals that we're identifying, that we have a climate in attendance. I'm hearing in the community that there's these organizations that we've allowed into our schools that are saying they're addressing this, but I did not hear from them what our strategy is as they come into our buildings. So I don't know what the question ultimately is. I don't necessarily need an answer right now, but that's something that I would like to know, how we're taking advantage of that.
Yeah, I hear you. It's a, like, return on our investment, working with the partners to align, to ensure that the strategies are being met, and then that way the administration can then demonstrate that success within the metrics.
Right.
So if we are identifying a deficiency in a certain group and we have partners that are supposed to be helping that group, are we actually seeing correlation or return on investment? So that's kind of an outside question, but important, I think, to consider as we kind of look and learn more about the data, because we're building this data across the whole administration.
And what we'll do is bring that back, because that's what the engagement and partnership team is working on, creating that database, making sure we have those metrics there so we can see how well that they are doing wherever they are providing those services. So you're right. So we can bring that back in the future.
And I can I just jump in? Oh,
Because I know.
Okay, I just wanted to, she might say something too, but I just wanted to jump in too to say that our department, equity department, is also leaning in to work with community engagement, because one of the issues is that schools can on their own pull partners in. And so what we're trying to do is just see what's the whole lay of the land to know who the partners are. So every meeting I'm in where I hear a principal say, yeah, we're doing, like to your point, I just start writing them down and say, let's go find this group. And one of the things that we, because schools have done that on their own, sometimes we haven't had a larger kind of push to, these are the metrics that we want to see. So what we've been doing is really trying to find, especially if they relate to equity, find those organizations that are maybe working with, focused on Black girls, or the different things, to say, what are the outcomes that you currently track next to these are the outcomes that we need to have tracked. And sometimes there are organizations that don't necessarily think about their work in that way. They just think, well, if we served 50 girls this year, we served 100 girls next year, then we're successful. Instead of really thinking about, if we're doing that, or we're saying we're doing cell work and or whatever as an organization, what does that look like? And how can we, as the customer, client, kind of thing, as the district, how can we communicate what we need to have tracked, so that we know that what folks are doing in our buildings is what we need it to do? So, I mean, that's a very good question.
I think it's very
So
concerning.
I know, we'll talk about it, but this isn't the monitoring part. We're gonna stop this part, and actually part of its future, so maybe it can come.
Well, I was gonna go to the monitoring part, because it is important for us to monitor that, because I will tell you, I had some concerns when they're doing social emotional.
Vice President Reyes?
Social emotional pieces.
Yeah, it's not part of this exact monitoring report, so, but for pinning social emotional stuff. Okay. All right. Do you have any additional?
No, that was my last one.
All right. Anyone else have any who, what, why questions? Board Member Brown.
I'm not certain if I've got who, what, why questions, but I've got a few questions.
We will
You'll
try.
let me know.
Yep.
And I guess for each of you, and for Dr. Dixon, this is a new system. We're now months into this kind of monitoring and the kind of information that you're gathering to be able to present to us. Has this approach, based on the months that we've done it so far, have you found it helpful in each of your roles, or has it gotten in the way? Does it reveal things that we wouldn't otherwise know, or does it not do that? And the rest is that have you observed any changes, especially positive changes, in the classroom between teachers and students, right where the heart of the work is? And that's what I'm asking.
That is a really great question, and definitely something I think we should discuss but that would not be part of this monitoring. It would be an evaluation of the whole process that we're doing. We need to spend our time focused on the report that they've given us and the data that's before us. I think that this has come up several times, so I'm going to go ahead and put on our next agenda a discussion about just without a monitoring. We're just going to talk about monitoring.
I appreciate your at least allowing me to state it all.
It was a good question. I mean, I think we all have those questions. It's very relevant, but just not this moment at 6:22 in the middle of a monitoring session. Do you have questions about the data that was presented?
I'm dying to provide an answer to that.
I know you are.
Me too.
I know you are.
Write it down.
Keep those in mind, please.
No, you don't have a question then? Those were your questions?
No. Several of them I did have that Christina took one and others, so I'm good.
Okay.
When the motion or the question was raised, did people have questions?
Okay.
I didn't hear that part. Can I ask one more question?
Let me ask a question first.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for providing the response when there was a question regarding the schools that were lower in their scores. I'm wondering, in that response, we've identified that there were reasonings, and poverty being one of the triggers to why we thought the 3 schools that were identified were underperforming. I'm wondering if that same rationale works for the higher performing schools, or if it's a different reason why they are higher performing. And then as a kind of a second question, regardless of where the schools fall on our color chart, some of our schools made either significant jumps up or down. And I'm wondering if we know why that was for some of those schools. Like, for example, regardless of the color that they are, Lyndon McKinley went from a 75.3% to a 57.5% graduation rate. That's a very significant drop. While we had other schools that are, continuously making gains, like a Northland. So that was kind of just with the data, like the rationale one for the lower performing schools that you've provided us, is that the same then, kind of opposite, and then the individual kind of growth decline?
So I think I would be best poised to talk about the sort of global relationship between income and academic outcome, and that's pretty clear. There's a lot of research out there that shows that unfortunately poverty is a pretty strong predictor, and affluence is also a pretty strong predictor. We saw that in that NCS data for NAEP, that families that had access to resources, the pandemic didn't impact them the same way as it did families that were further away from that. And again, it underscores truly the importance of our work here as a system to try to create equitable outcomes for our students, because irrespective of where our students live, they should have an equitable opportunity to learn, and we should expect equitable outcomes for them. But there is a clear relationship between income, family income, and academic outcomes, and this is part of how we think about resource allocation to try to compensate for that. For specific buildings, I'm probably not as close to individual buildings as some of my colleagues, and I think I would defer.
That's fine. Can I follow up on, so part of the, we're an open enrollment district, and we know that our kids are everywhere, not necessarily part of their home zip code, which would then be the economic factor.
So one of the things I think we have to tease out is the impact of choice. And I don't think we have a good answer for that, whether or not choice is facilitating equitable outcomes or not. I think that's an open question right now. I am convinced that choice likely has a negative impact on the strength of a community school, a neighborhood school, because students get pulled out and go to other places. And it acts as, from my point of view, from a data point of view, almost like a curveball. Like, it's hard to interpret the outcome for a building because I don't know how much of it's because children have elected to go someplace else. And if they were all in their home school, what would that school look like? So I think that's a big question to get at. And it is something that frankly makes it a little hard to interpret our outcomes from time to time. And part of why I've been a little reluctant to talk about regional outcomes, because with 45% of our kids going to school outside their home area, it's really hard to know whether or not that regional analysis tells me something about that, or does it tell me something about choice and the outcome of choice. Back to the individual school piece.
That's okay, you don't have to answer that. Okay. But so when you're looking at that data, the NAEP data, is it by zip code where the school is sitting or zip code of the students' homes?
The NAEP data?
Yeah, where you were, the correlation of the poverty, and you were talking about the NAEP data. Maybe it wasn't NAEP, I don't know.
No,
but where we're getting the, poverty data.
There are multiple studies out there that would link that relationship there. And we certainly know certain areas of the community have higher poverty rates than others. And the Wyndham-McKinley area is one that suffers with that. The West Side is one that clearly suffers with that. And those are two communities where we see high schools that are struggling and have been struggling over time. It's not something new, but it's been a pattern over time. And yes, as you see schools that are closer to the periphery or more affluent communities, you see different outcomes. And again, that I think is a function of agency as well as income.
Thank you. And Board Member Brown.
At the risk of my question being tabled again, let me just try one other question. This monitoring report, overall and every part of it, is very positive. It's good news in many ways, and that's how it's been presented. Everybody deserves a pat on the back for that. Yet we all know we have a very long ways to go. That where we are, I don't think is acceptable. So my question is, for each of you, do you feel as good about the data as you sounded in the presentation and as the report itself presents?
I'll take the first swing on it. I totally agree. The board has set a goal to raise the graduation rate. Yeah. I think the expectation of moving the graduation rate closer to 90% over time is a very sort of reasonable path forward. But graduation rates don't change overnight. And in fact, it takes a while to steer that ship in a different direction because, again, it's a cohort and it accumulates over 4 years. So you can't, you can't move it that quickly. You have to start moving. The things that I think are positive right now is, with the impact of the pandemic, we didn't see the losses that other folks saw. So we preserved outcomes for our kids that weren't seen in other places. I think that's a celebration. The fact that we're closer to our goal than maybe would have been anticipated based on the pandemic, I think is a celebration. The fact that we see some promising outcomes with our ESL program, I think that's something to be celebrated as well. The fact that our African American graduation rate is so high is really very, speaks to some things that have been going well here for a while. And so clearly not good enough. We definitely want to move in a different direction over time. I appreciate the idea that we're moving over time. But I think it's important to celebrate the wins because we have to build momentum. We have to maintain hope for our schools as well and acknowledge the hard work of everyone that helped preserve those outcomes for our kids. So good enough, no, but happy that we're where we are right now, absolutely.
Thank you.
Board Member Beckerly.
Dr. Chapman, I'd like to focus on something you said that was kind of getting at root cause. You said if we had a social worker here, they'd be able to go through the litany of why students are not attending and or dropping out. And it could be everything from they had to take a job to support their family, they have to take care of their family members, to they don't feel connected to they don't have a connection with another positive adult, to they're struggling academically, so they're disengaged, the whole laundry list. Have we made any effort to sort of collect that data? Like there's 10% of our kids that have taken jobs instead, or, and sort of to figure out frequency, and or maybe then, once we kind of have our arms around it a little bit, you could think about strategies. So I'm wondering, are we starting to look at it that granularly?
At the school level, yes. So as I mentioned before, early intervention includes each cohort team, a team of professionals representing, mental health experts, maybe the nurses on the team, social workers, school counselor, principal, AP, department chair is on that team. They're looking at the cohort and they're looking at each student, and they're discussing, the needs of the cohort as well as the individual needs. And it comes down to basically case management for the students who are off track. And for the students who are off track, the schools are working to pair those students with mentors. Perhaps if they're a senior, they might be paired with a graduation coach, they might be paired with a teacher, they might be paired with a counselor or social worker, but they need to have that one-on-one relationship, someone that's reminding them, encouraging them every day, come to school, this is why it's important. You're working on, you have your full caseload of courses, and then you also are working on Apex. We want to encourage you, support you. How can we keep you connected and keep you engaged? So it comes down to case management, and it's on a case-by-case situation because every student's needs may be different. The dynamics may be different. The barriers may be different. And we're empowering the team to make sure that they have the resources that they need to make those connections and provide that support as needed.
Well, I love that, and I kind of, well, never mind, I'm not supposed to say that. Next question. What I was trying to get at was something a little bit different, which is certain factors, like I had to take a job, or I have to stay home and take care of family members. All the case management in the world might not be able to solve that, but there might be other possibilities of strategies once we kind of wrapped our hands around it, like maybe evening school or Saturday school or half-day school, or and then you take an extra year or whatever. And I'm wondering, what, if anything, are we doing to capturing the frequency of those sorts of problems to see if we can come up with a system-wide solution? That's my question.
We are asking, so for example, each high school team would know best in terms of what the needs are. We're meeting with our high school principals every month to make sure that we all have our eye on the goal. At those meetings, we're sharing those board goals as well as the interim goals that we have for each cohort. And then we're also checking in on how their cohort meetings are going. And so they're giving us feedback in those meetings to share. These are, whether it's an obstacle that the system is creating, an obstacle that that's in the environment, the district, whatever, they are bringing those challenges to us so that we can, again, strategize and provide the supports necessary. So there's ways to provide the feedback upward, downward, and across to make sure that we are supporting matriculation across all schools and every cohort.
That's terrific. Thank you.
All right, let's move into the how question, so the future-focused strategies questions. Dr. Pierce.
Thank you for this report. I echo the comments of Board Member Brown in regards to us being better and getting better with this. I'm interested in our strategy around Apex. Could you explain that strategy and how it impacts the data that we're seeing right now?
So currently, Apex is used in a myriad of ways. Predominantly, Apex is a credit recovery strategy. And so what we see is, building principles at the high school level. If a student has failed a course, those students are being enrolled typically in VCAP during the day, and those students have a teacher that's monitoring. There are also instances where students are being, enrolled in after-school VCAP that is occurring at the school site, or virtual Apex. And so that's all kind of a credit recovery model. They're all, Apex can also be used for sort of acceleration for credit advancement. And so typically this happens when students are seniors, and because, for whatever reason they haven't taken the course, or they have, usually this is students who have failed multiple courses, so their schedule doesn't allow for a course that they haven't taken. In those instances, students will be enrolled in Apex for a sort of credit advancement model. A third sort of iteration of how Apex works is that, and this is to Dr. Chapman's point a little bit earlier, is that Apex can be used sort of as an intervention strategy. And so we're seeing some of our principals who are thinking very creatively, and this has been, vetted with our internal auditor to make sure that we're staying consistent with appropriate practices, where they're looking at the power standards. And if a student has failed, let's say Algebra 1 for the first 9 weeks, we're looking at the principal partnering with the teachers and saying, okay, what standards did the student fall short on, and those students are then able to take just those particular modules as a way to advance their grade from an F to a D plus, or to passing.
Thank you for sharing that. My next question is, are we currently collecting data around the percentage of students that are enrolled in Apex courses?
Dr. Pierce, can I ask you a question? Because I'm trying to figure out what time period this goes in.
It goes in future.
These don't sound like future questions to me. They sound like, what are we currently doing right now? Which is fine. We can go back to the past questions. I'm just for time-wise.
Let's cut to the chase. How are we ensuring that our students are not opting for Apex courses as opposed to taking in-person courses with teachers and actually learning the materials?
So, historically, and what we found is that, the courses that are taken virtually are usually more challenging because the students don't have the support of the teacher in the learning of the instruction. And again, I was high school principal for 10 years in our district, and what we found is that students were typically most successful in taking courses in person with faculty members. We are aware of a recent complaint that came forth that was expressing some concerns around Apex being used to supplant a higher quality sort of instruction that students would get in person. And so that was immediately flagged by Dr. Dixon and our team, and we're working with the internal auditor, Terry Burchek, on her team to ensure that we have clear communication across all of our schools. And so right now, that is currently under investigation. We're looking into it. But what we're going to make sure that we do is make sure that there's consistent, clear implementation fidelity across all of our schools. We're going to make sure that we communicate clearly what those standards are. And we know that there were some shifts that occurred during when we were on the pandemic, and we want to just revisit that to make sure that our practice is consistent with the utmost integrity and ensuring that students' grades accurately reflect their learning.
I appreciate your honesty and vulnerability in sharing that the investigation is underway and you all are looking into this. I am very concerned that it will impact not only our graduation rates, but also the academic success of our students that are in 9 through 11th grade. I spoke to students. I understand that answers to APEX assignments and tests are online. And as an instructor, as a past student in this district, or a past student period in life, sometimes students want to take the easier path. And so if it's easier for me to take an APEX course where the answers are already there, then I'm gonna just do it and get it done very quickly. And so I think that as we get these types of monitoring reports, it's important for us to understand what are those other elements and strategies that we may be using for intervention that might start to impact or negate the real outcomes that we want to see in our students. I mean, APEX ultimately helps our graduation rate, but are the students actually learning the skills and materials they need to be successful?
There was no question there.
No.
Do you have a question?
No, that's all my questions and comments for this entire monitoring period. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Any other how questions?
Just had one quick question.
Vera.
So how exactly are we engaging students and families who have, in fact, left the district? I just want to understand what is our strategy for the percentage of students and families who have left.
We have, for the students, for example, once a student is identified as chronically absent or truant, we have clear procedures across the district of how to engage and to re-engage that student and the family, including phone calls, letters, as well as home visits. So there's clear procedures that all have to be documented. We can't withdraw a student after we've made significant attempts to find, locate, and re-engage the student. Once the student is withdrawn, particularly for our high school students, we have a team that is responsible for reaching out and trying to locate the students and re-engage them. And again, that is an ongoing process. It's more challenging to re-engage the students after they have, they're truant. It's easier, so earlier intervention is key, right? To keep them engaged on the front end than have to try to locate them after, they've had a excessive number of absences.
Thank you. And one other question, Dr. Chapman. Earlier when you were kind of expressing how the cohorts collect all the data and on the building level monthly, how is all of that information collected and stored? Is that a report that comes to you, or how exactly are we collecting all of that information monthly from the different buildings?
Great question. So we have, right now, we have a spreadsheet that we are working on. It's a senior spreadsheet that we have, and then we have worked with our colleagues in Dr. Blue's office, the school counseling team. They have determined what it means to be on track and off track at each point in the quarter, or each quarter. So for quarter one, 9th grade, you need so many credits to be on track. Quarter one, 10th grade, you need so many credits to be on track. So we have aligned on our expectations, common expectations, so that if one school is reporting their on-track data, it means the same as they're using the same definition as school A. And so we have, for each high school, we have a spreadsheet for each cohort where we can look at that spreadsheet at the end of each quarter to determine that movement. Now that data is fluid, it changes regularly. Student can be on track 1 minute and then off track after not showing mastery on a test or something of that nature. So it's a moving target. And eventually, we will have a district-wide system for tracking this data that will give us early warning indicators, so we won't have to go into a spreadsheet and a tab, and it will talk to us. It will send me alerts and say, Dr. Chapman, we have this many students off track at such and such school, or the 9th grade cohort. And that is a new product that we're working on standing up across multiple departments
in our district, and we will be very excited to set aside our spreadsheets and move to a database that talks to us and gives us that feedback in real time.
Thank you. And I guess my final question, follow-up to that was, how long do you think that system is going to take is that something that we're looking at for this year, next year? Just curious.
It's a great question because we talk about that every day.
Okay.
I'm going to refer to Dr. Brown.
So we actually have a couple systems that lean into that type of work. One is a data warehouse, which we are revalidating and launching again this year. It has an early warning indicator system built into it. We are currently building the staff necessary to support said system. It takes some folks with some pretty unique IT skills to be able to maintain a system like that over time. What I particularly like about that is it will allow our school leaders and central office folks to be able to access data without having to ask someone. They'll just be able to see it. And it will allow point-in-time comparison. So I'll be able to look at where we are now versus where we were last year, where we were the year before. And again, empowers people to do that type of work. We're well underway with that. I actually expect certain components of that to be launching very, very soon. But again, we're building the staff to support that. We also have another tool that the system's been working with that helps with scheduling, the planning around post-secondary outcomes for students, and the tracking of cohorts over time. And that's in the works as well. So I fully expect by the start of next year to be in a much better position around this. And to have data available to our schools and our end users in a way that doesn't require asking. I want to teach people how to fish rather than consistently handing data sets to people or working with antiquated spreadsheets, et cetera, which are, for lack of a better way to put it, dead on arrival. The minute you get them, they're outdated.
So we can anticipate fall 2023 is what you're saying?
I absolutely anticipate our warehouse is going to be up and running by fall 23, and I would expect that we'd be further along and closer to full implementation with the other system by that time as well.
Thank you.
Board Member Beckerly, then Vice President Reyes.
What does early What does early intervention look like for our Hispanic student disabilities and homeless and students with disabilities and English learner students going forward? Like, what are some examples of the early interventions that we're using to try to get them across the stage?
So I'm going to invite Dr. Mickey Nelson to come up and speak specifically to special education, but as she's coming, I can give some general comments. For our special education students, we're looking at MTSS as a key tool because with that particular student population, they typically are falling more into the Tier 2 and Tier 3 intervention needs. And so when we talk about come on up. When we talk about what the needs of that particular student population, what they are, it's important for us to really think about, okay, what do we want students to know? How are we going to know if they've learned it? Which, we use that iReady data to track that. And then what are we going to do if they don't know it? That becomes critically important. So Dr. Nelson, if you want to add to that.
Sure. Good evening. So when it comes to graduation for students with disabilities, the one key component for all of them is their transition plan. That is Section 5 of their IEP. We are required to have that plan in place by age 14, and that really does set the stage for what their high school experience is going to be. So within that, then, our transition coordinators play a key role in ultimately, to your question, getting them across the stage, but also making sure that, as we know, over the last couple of years, the Ohio Department of Ed has changed the graduation criteria. So now we have other components to think about in terms of not just credits, but also participation in statewide testing and in attaining SEALs. So that is a large part of what our transition coordinators help to coordinate. And then we on the back end support everybody having an understanding of how our students can access and make sure that they have all of those opportunities for them to graduate on time within their cohort 4-year group. So key piece to them is that transition plan. The intervention strategies that we use that are really a part of that Tier 3 support system include things in programming like SPIRE, which is a reading intervention program, our Sound Sensible, which is, again, another reading intervention program. So all of our intervention teachers have access to different programs based on the population of students that they work with to, again, make sure that our students have not only the intervention opportunities, but also that they have opportunities to participate in Tier 1 quality instruction by our gen ed experts.
And so I guess the question is, what are we doing that's extra or different?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for our students with this,
What will we be
what
doing?
are we?
I'm sorry, yeah, what are we doing going forward? That was what I was.
Yes. So one of
order
the
to
things, actually,
increase them.
sure, very timely, we have a meeting next week with our state support team to ensure that we have all of the most updated data or information coming out of the Ohio Department of Ed as it relates to our students with disabilities having a pathway, clear pathways to graduation. So we are meeting with them. It is an interdepartment collaboration. And then from there, we will be creating various resource guidance documents as well as opportunities for access to programs that ensure that when our students get into and land in high school, the minute that they cross the doorway, we know exactly what the plan is for each and every one of those students. Whether or not it's partnering with an outside service organization to allow them opportunities to work, so you're familiar with the process. So it's really about, as we move forward, working with our state support team colleagues and the Ohio Department of Ed, the Office of Exceptional Children, to make sure that for each one of those requirements, every one of our students with disabilities, regardless of their need, have a pathway. So we're currently working on that, and there will be more information to come that will be shared out with our building leaders, with our teachers, with our transition coordinators, with our school counselors.
Thank you. Vice President Reyes.
Thank you. It's not
okay.
good.
Thank you.
Let me see if I can do this. So, given what we know about the anecdotal data that some of our students may be dropping out due to needing to work, what will we be looking at work-study type of programs for our students?
Well, what we've typically been utilizing is Apex because that provides the greatest flexibility around students who may have an obligation or may not be able to attend during the traditional school day, and so. But to our conversation earlier, we want to ensure that that program is being implemented with fidelity, and that we have kind of clear parameters around the expectations for that, so that the outcomes that students are receiving and the grade that's reflected is representative of work that is commensurate with that grade. So, but we've seen success with that. We do have a history of best practices. We want to make sure that those practices are being scaled and implemented with fidelity across the district. And so that's kind of where we currently are in terms of thinking through flexible options for students who may have needs that are unique and that don't allow them to attend during the normal school hours.
Is there an opportunity for us to look at the career school model as an option for our students? So we already have students that are currently working or interning and going to school. Is that?
Yeah, it is viable. We have multiple instances of students who have been able to, through our career tech program, have been able to work and go to school, or have summer internships that provide a significant stream of income. So I think we are continuing to investigate that and expand those opportunities across our district. We know that there's a growing need for career tech with Intel coming, Honda's expanding, Google, and multiple other opportunities. I hear we are the Silicon Valley of the Midwest now, and so, but we know that presents some opportunities for us to put students on a pathway to learn and earn.
Vice President Reyes, your last two questions contained suggested answers. So
But it's taking models that we currently have.
I hear you, but it's just the technical form of your question is incorrect.
How would you recommend it be asked?
You would just have to ask it more open-ended. What strategies are you thinking about to address the needs of students who you've identified anecdotally as leaving?
It's not giving me my responses.
Right, because you're suggesting the answers that you want to hear. It's just the technical part of we can talk about this next meeting.
Well, but the second one is specifically saying how are we going to, I could have said it, how will we grow our technical program? Would that be a better question?
What's the plan?
It's more open.
Okay, so, because those are the dating myself, we had DACA. So, those of us who grew up in the 70s and 80s, we had DACA, which is not career schools. What was my other question? So, earlier, I believe President Adair asked this question about the, how do we track students? Do we track students by zip code or by school? So my question is, and I could be corrected on this one, what tools do we need to be able to evaluate each student's barriers to success as an individual versus a building? Almost goes to the question of how can the board help? So what are those tools?
What are you doing to do that?
So what do they need from
What do they need from us? What tools do they need in order so that we can track each student versus the building? And maybe we don't know the answer right now, but I thought.
It's quite a large question,
Yeah.
actually. We have a tremendous amount of data on our students, and I think the question is, how do we move from data to information? And then how do we integrate other pieces of information in a way that are meaningful for informing individualized instruction and pathways forward for students? We first, I think, have to integrate data and have it, again, available to folks in a way that's actionable and is informative on the front end. But we definitely need to, and we've had conversations today that intimate the idea of bringing in other pieces of data or aligning other resources. So what does it mean to have a plan that involves collective efficacy with a community partner where we're monitoring data together towards an academic outcome for our students? That is a direction that I think we need to go, but we first need to bring our data together in a way that is actionable to begin with, and then start bringing people together. We have used a tool and are currently using a tool that facilitates some of that with our community partners. It's called Learning Circle, and it is a tool that we have made available to help organize access of information for our community partners around that work around collective efficacy. And again, it's something that I think we can lean into over time. I do have to make just a caveat comment today. Our principals watch this. They're watching you learn. It's powerful when we can get in front of them and talk, giving them permission to learn as well and change their behavior. So this active learning that we engage in is powerful for our community, and it will take time for it to trickle down.
When we're talking about students with disabilities, and we can track them through IEP, none of those tools can?
We have a variety of,
what's the difference?
we have a variety of tools that are accessible, and this is a long conversation. So part of it would be, what what's the audience for a tool? What data is available? How does it integrate with others? Does it, I'm a big fan of one version of the truth, so
Right.
if I'm looking at it at the system, we should be looking at it the same way as a building, we should be looking at it the same way for a classroom, we should be looking at it the same way for a student, and it's a vertical conversation upward. We don't have quite the level of integration with that in terms of access. When you ask about tools, we have a GIS system that allows us to look at where students live. And so we can look at outcomes based on where students live versus where they attend. And I think that's very interesting. We're making that data right now available to our attendance team so that they can look at where kids live and begin to tailor responses based on where students live. Again, how do we provide data in a way that's actionable and helps us leverage and move forward? Again, we're just beginning to get some of this off the ground, but I'm very excited about where I think we can go.
Thank you. It's just like having an IEP for our entire district versus only for a small segment of our population. I appreciate that.
Yep, thank you.
One more, Vera.
This was for Mrs. Nelson. A question kind of came to mind after Board Member Beckerly. But given what you know just about kind of the strategies that you're evaluating right now and some of the new ODE requirements for our special education, I guess my question is, are we assessing what our staffing and resource needs are going to be as part of that strategic plan?
Yeah.
I was just curious if that's something we're...
Yes, absolutely. One of the things we're taking a look at pretty much daily is the staffing needs that we have and how we can ensure that all of our teachers feel supported so that they can best support our students. As we know, all across the nation, again, Dr. Brown spoke to some of those the national crises that we have and we're facing. Staffing is an issue. And so that is something that we're always continuing. We currently have a process in place to grow our own special education teachers. We have that system now that allows gen ed teachers who are interested in getting the endorsement to go through with that, and we will support them through that. So that is a huge piece for us. We currently have 87 teachers involved in that process to ensure that we have the staffing levels that are appropriate to meet the needs of our students. We're continuing to work with our Human Resources Department on recruitment. How can we recruit candidates, both at the end of the year, in May when we have graduates, but also mid-year, and staying in line with what other districts in the area are doing, where they're actually seeking out candidates, right at that December grad time. So we're wanting to make sure that we're in the front of those things as well. So yes, we want to make sure that we have appropriate staffing levels. As we've talked about with the pandemic, we continue to have students that are referred every day for special education consideration. And if those numbers increase, we want to be responsive to that and make sure that we have the appropriate levels to support all of our students and ultimately our families.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have a question. There was a comment about, really looking at the cohort and starting in 9th grade. And I know, maybe because this is my life living as a middle school parent right now, study habits, attendance habits, all that start much earlier. And so I'm going to talk instead of ask questions. Do any of that, are there strategies, are you thinking about strategies, or are there infusion of strategies to kind of work down into the middle school
How are
range?
you going to implant?
Yeah.
Yes, we're focusing on matriculation. For the purpose of this report, our conversations are around the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade cohort. But we are focusing on matriculation across the board. So making sure that our elementary students are matriculating to middle school, what that transition looks like, and that handoff from 5th grade to 6th grade. The same with the handoff between 8th grade and 9th grade. So those conversations are happening vertically, pre-K through 12, but, again, we focused on specific strategies for matriculation for the 9th through 12th grade cohorts.
Additionally, in terms of school improvement planning, we've asked our middle schools to focus on math because we understand the the role of math as a gatekeeper in high school. And so the strategy, again, is to work with our middle schools to have students coming into high school better prepared by focusing on math through our middle school environment.
Any additional How questions? All right, thank you, team, for the monitoring report this evening. Board members, now we need to evaluate ourselves. If you would like to flip to your progress monitoring student outcome evaluation. I believe our last evaluation, we did score ourselves a bit lower than previous ones. So the first category is in preparation. Were we ineffective, approaching effective, effective, or highly effective for this evening? What are your thoughts, board members? Effective. Every board member has read the monitoring report prior to the meeting and has begun developing potential questions. Seeing head nods.
Yeah.
What about in the data and opinions? Where do you think we are? Ineffective, approaching effective, effective, or highly effective? In between approaching, so approaching conversation is focused on board member opinions of school system performance with reference to data presented in their monitoring report. Between, conversation is focused on understanding the data presented in the monitoring report.
I agree with Vice President Reyes, but I think that we are leaning much more toward effective than we have in the past. I thought this was a good session.
Okay.
You have to redirect us just a couple of times.
Yeah, we're doing better.
All right, questions and statements. Where do you think we are? Ineffective, approaching, effective, or highly effective?
I would say effective. I feel like we were effective.
Effective conversation is mostly focused on questions about the data presented in the monitoring report. Okay, past and future. So our time was about, we had about 28 minutes in the past and, 28 minutes in the future and 47 minutes in the past. So we're about there, 2/3.
We're effective.
All right, progress monitoring and project management. Where do you think we are in that? Ineffective, approaching, effective, or highly effective?
Programs and understanding.
I feel like we were effective.
Effective.
I don't feel like.
Effective conversation is mostly focused on understanding performance rather than discussing school system operations or programs.
Yeah, I think that, I think we weren't mired in operations. Performance versus strategies, but I think that's all bound up in performance. We were talking a lot about strategies. Yeah, I think that we were effective.
Okay, so I think we did better than last time.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, board members. Thank you, team. And then we will put this on the agenda to actually discuss all of Board Member Brown's questions, and those will actually be the questions. I'll have Misty send those out to each of you so you can think about the responses.
Responsible for having all of you seated here with us during this discussion. I think that was a great idea, and I appreciate your being here. And with respect to my question about celebration or not, I do want to commend you all on working hard and on doing things. I don't want you to get the wrong impression by my question. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and move on to item 5, our internal auditor's report. Good evening, Auditor Smith.
Good evening, President Adair, Vice President Reyes, members of the board. My report will be brief because during our last audit and accountability meeting, most of the meeting was in executive session. So with that, I'll just briefly go through my report. As part of the FY 2022 audit plan, OIA conducted an audit of certain aspects of the information and technology, information security, and incident response systems. The report was presented to the Audit and Accountability Committee at its September 29, 22 meeting. Due to the subject matter and nature of the report, The report was discussed with the committee in executive session as permitted by Ohio Revised Code, Section 121.22 G6. During the public portion of the meeting, the committee voted to approve the report. The report was provided to all board members via secure email on or around October the 5th. If anybody has any particular questions that they want to discuss regarding the report, please reach out to me or my staff, and we'd be more than happy to set up a meeting to go over it with you. Because of the security nature of IT, we feel it best to present the report according to Ohio Revised Code in executive session. The second thing I just want to touch on briefly is in regard to the Apex concern that was discussed. My office is aware of the concern. We currently do not have an active investigation open. What we are doing is providing the knowledge that we have regarding how the program operates and some of the compliance issues that we have run across in the past to the management. So as they're going through and gathering information and facts, they have us as a resource. After they've done their kind of investigation, if we think there's a need for us to dig further, we will, and we will definitely discuss that as part of our Audit and Accountability Committee reports. But so far, there's no active investigation open by my office. So that concludes my report, and if the chair, co-chair want to share something.
I wanted to highlight at our next meeting, and now I'm wondering when is our next meeting, Carolyn? Because is there one in November? Because of Thanksgiving?
We'll have to talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
At the next Audit and Accountability meeting, when we figure out when it is, and this is to Dr. Dixon and Treasurer Stan. We are hoping to discuss risk assumption, comfort with risk. What are we doing? You know, how do we want to address that and have a rigorous discussion about as an organization? So stay tuned. That's a big topic, and we're looking to delve in, kind of, you know, in a open sort of open-ended. Let's think this through kind of way. You know, it was triggered by concerns or the reality that certain audits continue to be open over long periods of time. And so I think we'll certainly address that concern and how do we manage that, but also more generally our comfort level with risk and how that comfort level will or will not impact our ability to achieve our goals. So it's going to be a bigger conversation, but stay tuned, and we hope to have a lively discussion.
Are there any questions for the internal auditor?
That concludes my report. Thank you.
Thank you for your report. We will head to item 6, to the treasurer for the 5-year forecast.
Okay, good evening. Board members, tonight is my presentation on our 5-year forecast, the November 5-year forecast. This was shared with FAC a couple of weeks ago. Typically, I present it at the first board meeting in November with subsequent adoption at the second board meeting in November. But quite frankly, due to the material change since last we visited the forecast, I thought it best to share it with you now. I'm going to have, just note the time that Board Member Cole joins us. And just in time for the 5-year forecast. That was perfect. I thought it best to present it tonight. I will be presenting some questions that you will be answering. I say that you will be answering because I'll need some direction on that. I just let you know that this has been prepared by my team. And I just don't make one call out so that you know. It's always good to have backup for someone who I mean, I do a lot of the forecast. The document is mine. The prep, that whole mechanic of that is mine. But this year, we've been fortunate to have Matthew Cordes on the team, and he's been my data gopher, if you will, and he has really delved into much of the detail and knows the mechanics. So you're in good shape for whatever happens down there. Walk out the door or something. I forget, but no, this has been a great team effort to pull this together. So, the statutory requirement, to adopt one in November, a revised forecast in May, and again, you would revise it if anything significant happened. For instance, like in November of 2016, we passed an operating levy. So in December, we did a revised forecast. So right now, I think that we'll probably be at just November and May, but just understand that if something significant would happen in between times. So let me get into the major assumptions for this year's forecast, assuming technology works for me here. And it isn't.
Oh, you go.
Oh, now it's moving. That's okay. We'll see if it works here eventually for me locally. If not, I'm sure the gentleman in the back will help me out. Let's begin with the major assumptions about revenues. Now, understand that for the forecast, every line on the forecast, in the background, there are numerous lines of code in our accounting system. And we look at this line by line. But we do focus on certain, the major categories. You know that we have two major revenue categories, property taxes and state aid. So we spend a lot more time on those lines than we do other local income and the transfers and advances and things like that. On the expenditure side, the major line item is personnel. Non-personnel is driven primarily through our budget process and some modifications of those numbers based upon historical spend patterns. So in large part, personnel is driven by existing staff being carried forward, additions due to that we plan on in the staffing plan, recent collective bargaining agreements that were agreed to. But we do look at it line by line. But we really focus in on those major categories when we prepare this forecast. So let's talk about major assumptions that I want to point out to you in this particular forecast. A key item is that decreasing state aid. Heretofore, over all the 8.25 years that I've been here, state aid has been the Achilles heel for forecasting. When I got here, I think we'd received a 10% increase, so we assumed that, and then we got like 7. Then we assumed that, and we got 3. And I assumed that, and then we got 0. And then I assumed 0, and they cut us $9.5 million. So I can't win for trying to forecast state aid. As you know, there are a lot of issues that are, almost all issues about state aid are out of our control because it's driven by what the General Assembly decides in terms of the mechanism and the level of funding that feeds that mechanism. So in this particular forecast, we're under that new model just adopted within this last biennium. The design was that it would be phased in over 3 bienniums or 6 years, or a third, or 16% a year, if you will. It's just that simple math. And so at this point, we're about 33% phased in. The rest of it's not guaranteed. So my assumptions in this forecast are that the formula will not be phased in. I do assume the formula will exist as it is currently set up, but I assume that I make no assumption about phase-in. Within that, and I've mentioned it, I think at least once before here, and certainly more than once at Finance and Appropriations, that our declining enrollment is a double whammy for us. A significant piece of the funding formula is a percentage called state share. And it's that portion of the total calculation that we receive from the state. And that state share is largely driven by an indicator of wealth. The wealthier you are, the more you're expected to participate locally. So the less that percentage is for the state. It's kind of a simplification of how that works. Drivers in that ratio for local share are federal adjusted gross income and property value. It's divided by enrollment. In our case, for Columbus, AGI and I was going to say AV, assessed valuation, property values, are going up. Enrollment's going down. So it's real simple. It's just a ratio. And so our state share, therefore, goes up. If state share goes, I'm sorry, our local share goes up. Local share goes up, state share goes down. One of the most recent numbers I had was we dropped from about 32% to 29% in state share. So in our forecast, not only do we forecast declining enrollment, which ultimately, in any line in the forecast, where you get a dollar amount and it's times the number of pupils, and then it's times your state share, you can see that enrollment kicks in twice for us. And so, like I said before, it's like a double whammy. So we assume that the model still is in effect. State share for us will decrease and our enrollment will decrease. You're also aware that we're facing a transportation penalty when we don't get the students, the non-public and charter students to school within that, I think it's a 30-minute window. Complaints are filed, investigations made, penalties are assessed. We filed a lawsuit that's currently in litigation. We do have a stay on that penalty, but I suspect that we will likely get the penalty in some form down the road. I assume that transportation noncompliance penalty in the amount of about $15 million a year. It's a guesstimate on my part. Last year, before the stay was put in place, I think we were up to about $11.3 million that could be deducted. So I'm assuming that penalty stays in place for the duration of this forecast. We can change those assumptions, and that's what I'm going to get to later. But just so you know, that's $15 million a year that I've assumed we will be penalized. I mentioned here also the end-of-the-year advances, and primarily because what we had to advance at the end of the year, simply for cash flow purposes, and bring all the cash balances into the black, and because ESSER is so large, it's like a $78, $79 million advance. It goes out, it comes in, it goes out, it comes in, it goes out, and then lastly it comes in a year and doesn't go out that year, which is fiscal 25. So by the end of the forecast, it's cash balance neutral for the general fund and for this forecast. But I wanted to mention it because it causes a bump, an aberration in the graphs and the numbers. And you'll see when I talk about impact of changes since May, you'll see that stick out. But in essence, while it's large, you can ignore it. It's an accounting convention. All right. Let's move on. He moved? Good. All right. Let's move on to the major assumptions for expenditures. On the personnel side, you've recently agreed to a new agreement with the CEA. There's a Me Too clause for OPSI. I know you're contemplating agreements with a couple of associations. You're in negotiations with the new bargaining unit. I'm assuming that it's 4%. All right. In the latter years, outside the agreement, in this forecast, I put in 2.5%. Heretofore, it was 1. 1 was primarily a placeholder. Because this is really the first forecast, at least in my mind, the first forecast where we're really going to begin to talk about an operating levy, I wanted to do the best we could to make it realistic. There was no magic to the 2.5. It's 4 plus 1 divided by 2. I mean, I pulled that out and thought 2.5 is better than 1, and it doesn't presuppose that it's 4. It gives you a decent picture that if that is the case, all of this is about what does that do to the long-term picture. You can come back and change that assumption if you want, but that's what I've put in. 5-year staffing plan is still in place for the balance of the 4 years. I think that adds up to about 149 positions. The current conversation around ESSER positions, there are hundreds over there, but right now there's a pretty good indication that 88 positions relative to custodial and safety and security would come out of ESSER funding and be net additions to the general fund. And the conversation about ESSER positions should heat up over the next 6 to 12 months. You got to figure out what you're going to do with those positions when ESSER funding runs out. I assume through fiscal 24 that Wellness Week, the 3 days during the week of Thanksgiving, that staff is off and paid, it's paid leave. Currently, we're charging that to ESSER, so I assume that's going to continue. That's about $7.5 million a year that the general fund doesn't have to absorb, but that's only through fiscal 24. Then we go back to paying for it out of the general fund in fiscal 25. Again, I mentioned about the advances on the expenditure side. This is the offset on the expenditure side. And last, the next critical assumption that we're going to talk about is what we're doing about a capital budget. We have talked all the years that I've been here about how do we do a capital budget. And we had a $500,000 PI levy in 16, an Operation Fix at $125 million bond issue passed that began to scratch at the surface of our capital needs. Well, the $125 million was used for all the Operation Fix-It projects, and the $500,000 operating levy is here. As you know, I put together a plan for the permanent improvement levy to address life cycle replacement and other capital budget needs, and that levy was to be 4.7 mils. That generated a little over $50 million, $52 million a year to fund what I calculated to be a 20-25 year plan for meeting the capital budget needs. So that was on the ballot, now it's off the ballot. So why I put it here was to keep it in your top of mind awareness that you need to make a decision about capital budget funding. Right now, I put in a transfer of $40 million a year. It's not the 50-some million, but it's 40, and you can see the impact of that assumption. It's really a matter of either if you're going to fund a capital budget, yes or no, and if so, what's the source of revenue? Is it coming out of general operating dollars, therefore it's in the forecast, or is it going to come out of a PI levy? But that's a decision and a choice and direction you can give me relative to capital funding. The impact of this, if I can get to the next slide, is that your cash balance and your reserved balance for 60 days cash looks like the following. If we go to the next slide, the takeaways here are, in fiscal 24, the 60-day cash balance, the early indicator of the need to take action, that goes negative in 24. Next slide. We go negative in cash in fiscal 25. That'll come up in the next slide. There we go. And then the end of the forecast, which is the next slide, is $430 million in the red. And those are the takeaways there as key indicators. When does our 60-day cash go negative? We don't meet that 60-day balance. When do we actually go cash negative? That's bad, just so you know. That's you can't do that, and that's untenable. But the fact that it's forecasted, it has some implications for us. And then lastly, it's the $430 million deficit that's projected at the end of this forecast. And by the way, I trend this out, which is strictly trending. There's no discussion with anyone about how do I go from fiscal 27 to fiscal 30. I'm sorry, yeah, fiscal 27 to fiscal 32. I just simply take that trend and continue it on. So that's why that shape of that curve is very smooth. It continues its pathway, basically here into about a $2 billion abyss. That's not possible. We've got to react to that. All right. Now, just to give you a comparison to May and those indicators, when do expenditures exceed revenues? Well, in May, 21 which was historical, we were deficit spending. And then 25-26, we were deficit spending. 22, we had actually projected to build a cash balance. But as a result of the advances, we didn't. So in November now, all of our years in the forecast, from 21 actual and 22 actual through 26, expenditures exceed revenues. I don't put 27 in there as, but it does. We do exceed revenues, but this is a comparison. Expenditures do exceed revenues. I don't list it there in this chart because 27 didn't exist in the May forecast. That was the new year coming in. The other one is, when does our reserve cash go negative? It was in 26 in the May forecast. We're now at 24 when it comes into the picture. And when do we go cash balance negative? In May, we didn't show a cash balance negative. Now, I knew from trending that the year after that, 27, would have been negative, but in the actual forecast period, we weren't ever projecting a negative cash balance. In this forecast for November, we've moved to 25. The takeaway here is that all those early warning signals and negative cash positions have moved 2 years closer as a result of the change in those assumptions relative to state aid, capital budget, and the impact of the increasing cost of personnel. Go to the next slide. So what are the changes since May? I'd like to highlight those. In the graphs, just as an indicator, though some will be marked left-hand scale, LHS, and because they're combo graphs, and the right-hand scale for the change numbers. So we can go to the next graph. So walking through each line fairly quickly. Property taxes, May to November, not much change. I do that settlement period by settlement period, and when I adjust when I bring the actuals in, it'll sometimes move dollars out of one year into the next, but that change line is pretty much plus or minus about $2.5 to $3 million. So over the life of the forecast, not a big difference. The annual year-over-year rate of change back in May was about 2.24%. In this particular forecast, slightly increased at 2.38%. The only thing that changes over time for this is primarily driven by reappraisal and updates, and those are small because of House Bill 920. The only increases we receive are on inside millage, and that's a very small portion of our total levied millage. So property taxes, not much change since May. When we get to state aid, next slide, we'll see that here's the big change. And May we were pretty much forecasting flat, and now we're seeing about a 3.5% year-over-year drop. But remember, the two big factors in state aid, declining enrollment and that change in our state share, and the $15 million transportation penalty. Those are the two drivers of that rather large, significant change. Going on to other local, next slide. Really no change from May at all. And the drop there in fiscal 25 are the pilots coming out. If you recall, last forecast I pulled out about $12 million a year because those outside settlements, those payment arrangements that we do outside of the Board of Revision and Board of Tax Appeals process, those are now not allowed by law, and so I've pulled out that estimated revenue for there. But relative to May, no change. We go on to other financing sources, in other words, the revenue side. Here you see the spike for that transfer coming back, or that, I'm sorry, the advance coming back, the $79 million advance coming back. So that just shows you that temporary bump that it makes in that revenue line. And so then when you see total revenues, year over year back in May, next slide. There we go. Year over year in May was about 1.25% growth. Now it's about 0.76, or relatively flat in the aggregate for total revenues. All right. So quite frankly, that advance distorts that because total revenues without that would be declining because of the change in state aid. So just looking at sources of change, and this is, the colors are here just to remind you, just big categories. What were the sources of change? Well, other financing sources, a large positive, and state aid was the big negative. That's the only takeaway here. So I'm just trying to get you to focus in on those changes. Now, let's move on to expenditures. First item and expenditures is personnel. If you look at that gray line there, you can see that it steepens here in 2024, 25, and that's the impact of those new collective bargaining agreements and additional staff. That rate of growth has changed since May, where we had 3s and 1s in, 3% for the existing agreements that were running out and 1% assumed thereafter. We now have 4s and 2.5s. So that growth line has changed. We've gone from a 3.6 annual year-over-year growth rate to about 5.8% year-over-year annual growth rate. In the non-personnel area, one of the adjustments that we made was to look at the budget amounts and adjust them down a little bit further based upon historical spends. So while the dollar amount is less, it's fairly small, you can see that it's probably in that $1 million to $2 million a year. The growth rate has changed from 7.8% in May year-over-year to 6.25% year-over-year. And that was simply our assumption about what the actual spend would be. And I didn't point this out, but as you go back and look at this, if you look at the scale, the left-hand scale of the dollar amount, you get an idea of the relative impact each line item has on the overall budget. We're in the back on the personnel side. That scale was running in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and in non-personnel it barely reaches the 100 million. So, all right, let's go on and look at sources of. This is debt service. I'm sorry. Debt service is unchanged. Go on to the next slide. Other financing uses. I've lost my track here, over here. Hang on for a minute. Other financing uses. These are the advances and transfer out. You can see the jump there. And this is also where that transfer is for the capital budget. Next slide. This just shows you the impact on total expenditures. So you can see those jumps in 24 and those changes there, 24, 25, and 26, all primarily driven by personnel and the advances and transfers out. Next slide. So again, highlighting just sources of change. And it's clear, other financing uses, those advances and transfers, a big ticket item, and personnel, the blue bar. So when we focus on our discussion, and this is at a very macro level, we're not going to get down. You heard a long presentation about what you're doing. We're not going to. We haven't made that link between what's it cost to do all of that and its impact here. We're at a very high level trend of, are we able to sustain all that we do on the academic side? All right. So here we have the sources of change. Clearly, that other financing sources, which is temporary, and then the personnel piece, which is longer lasting. Okay, next slide. Impact on cash balance, and you can see here, this is a financial cliff, but it's not the financial cliff we talked about before. You heard about before. That was a financial cliff based upon ESSER. Well, ESSER isn't impacting this because there's only 88 people coming over, 88 FTE. So this isn't the ESSER financial cliff. You start to bring those over, this gets more severe. This is just the change since May and how these assumptions for state aid, the transfer for capital budgeting, and personnel have impacted cash balance. And you can see that drop. Again, real quickly, next slide. I just spent a lot of time, probably way too much time, just trying to draw your attention on the sources of change. Revenues were positive. Again, expenditures were really driving the negative side. Next slide. They accumulate where changes in revenue account for about 138 million positive in cash balance. Go to the next slide, please, I think. Yeah, 138 million. That's cumulative, and about 467 in terms of million in terms of the expenditure change. Those net out to the 310 million. So movement in cash balance in FY26, negative movement in FY26 from May to November. Again, just next slide, analyzing the sources of change. You have 3 revenue items: state aid, other financing sources, and then everything else in revenue, and then 3 categories in expenditures: personnel, other financing uses, and everything else. Well, other financing sources and uses play off of each other, so I break that out just so you can see how that works out. Go to the next slide, and you'll see that they tend to offset themselves. See the advances going out and then coming in, going out and coming in, kind of a diagonal across those bars. And at the end of the day, what remains is that 43 million change since May, which is the addition of that capital budget number. We go on to the next slide, we can see how that accumulates in terms of their contribution to a change in cash balance. And if we net those out on the next slide, you'll see that it amounts to about $117 million. And that's 3 years of 40, about 120 million. So the net result, it all works it out. Those advances in and out work themselves out. You're left with the net impact of other sources is all the decision you're going to make about capital budgeting. When we go on and look at all the other items, you'll see that it's state aid and personnel, just what I said earlier. All the other expenditures and all the other revenue items didn't change from May significantly at all to have an impact on cash balance. And the next slide just makes this a cumulative, so where this contributes about 212 million negative, and the next slide will bring it all together so you can see that state aid and the transfer for capital contributed about 212 to the decline in cash balance. And those, personnel and state aid contribute 212 to the declining cash balance is 26. And the transfer out for capital contributes 117 million. So that focuses our attention at this level on what you need to consider and make some comments about those assumptions. Next slide. So when we compare, keep going, next one. Now here we're at the 2 cash balance pictures, and you can see that precipitous drop off in cash balance. So let's go to decision points. Next slide. So here are the key things I asked Finance Committee to give me some feedback on. I want you to give me some feedback on. You can do it tonight. We've got a whole nother week. We can talk outside of this meeting. I've got it on the agenda for the November 1st. We can have more discussion then. And I can literally plug and play into the forecast. If you say this is out, or don't use 2.5, use 3, whatever you want to do. This is your chance. This is your forecast. So it's your chance to have an impact on these major assumptions that I think drive the forecast. First of all, state aid. What do you want to assume regarding the phase-in of the new formula? And what do we do about the transportation penalty? What do you think a reasonable assumption is? On personnel, the question I have is 2.5 assumed in the out years sufficient? Is that an okay number to use to give you a comfort level for what the future might look like, and that you probably should plan for? And then what do we do with the ESSER positions? Put in 88. Now, quite frankly, that one you probably won't be able to answer in the next 3 weeks. But remember, this is a precursor to what Google's trying to help me out and give me a definition of what I'm talking about. Sorry. This is a precursor to our discussions in the spring when we know more about what they're talking about, the state budget. And it's really November of 23 where it's really going to look at this and go, by golly, we've got about 6 months to go before we make some decisions about the amount that we put on the ballot. There are a lot of discussions, as you all now know, having gone through this levy, putting things on the ballot, a lot of other discussions that go on. The November 23 forecast will be the one that you're really going to hang your hat on in terms of what we need to pass in November of 24. I'm working off of November 24. You may look at this and say, I'm nuts. We need to go earlier, or I don't want to go. I mean, we'll get into that discussion. So here's where we are. So so anyway, the ESSER positions, right. And then capital funding, in or out. I make it sound simple, but really when you start, that's the simple. If you put it in, great. What level do you want to put it in? I put 40. In the email I sent to you outlining all of this, I believe I gave you a table where I did the ESSER positions and I did capital funding, just a sensitivity analysis. I think I did it using the 88 positions. I did it 10 positions at a time to give you an impact. And on capital budget funding, I did it 10 million at a time to see the impact on ending cash balance. And what we're going to talk about next is millage impact. So if we go to the next slide, here's a reminder of what our current assumptions are. The formula is not fully funded. It exists, it continues, but it's not fully funded. We keep the $15 million transfer or the transportation penalty in. 2.5% is in the out years where the agreements have expired and not yet been negotiated. And we put the 88 positions in. And yes, we're going to fund capital out of the general fund, and we're going to do it at $40 million a year. And that generated that picture. And you kind of went, well, as we sat and we said, well, we should at least give you some sensitivity analysis here. And so my team said, well, let's change some of these assumptions and give you another picture. So we went in. If you go to the next slide, it should show us the revised assumptions, number one. And we left, we changed state aid. We said, what if it's fully funded? So we went ahead and did the next 33% and 33% for the next biennium. We did include declining enrollment, though, and changes in state aid. We let the formula work, but we funded it at a higher level. And then we said, no, we're going to fix the transportation problem. We're not going to get penalized 15 every year. Personnel, we left it alone. Yes, 2.5 is good, 88's in, and we took capital budgeting out. To me, that's, I don't want to say it's low-hanging fruit, but it's, you don't have a capital budget now, so taking it out, you're just going to delay capital expenditures longer, and we've been doing that for quite some time. So that was easy for me to say because we're not reducing positions, we're not cutting program, we just aren't doing capital. So what does that give you in terms of the picture in cash balances? Go to the next slide. Here's where we are in current assumptions, and then go to the next slide. And here's how it changed under assumptions number one. In 24, we're still in the deficit. In terms of 60-day cash balance. We're better, but we're still negative. FY25, that was the first year we went negative with cash, under these assumptions, we've gone positive. But at the end of the forecast, we're still negative. So that set of assumptions helps you out and improves that picture as one might expect. We go to the next slide. After all the charts, actually, after all the graphs, here's a chart which kind of where the rubber meets the road, because this is the big question. We know what the impact is on cash balances, but what's the impact on a levy request? Here are my assumptions for this analysis. Number one, you'll put an operating levy on the November 24 ballot. That means you're in fiscal 25, which is why I put a box around those two cells there. I put a box around FY29, the blue box, because the levy passed or proposed for November of 24 is intended to fund, if you're on a 4-year levy cycle, fiscal years 26, 27, 28, and 29. So when you reverse engineer this, you want to get 29 to 0. That's never a great target. Probably should be our 60-day reserved cash balance. But if you don't like this picture, you sure as heck aren't going to like that picture, okay? So I'm working off of cash. If you want me to change that and work off a 60-day reserve, we can do that. So you can see here that under the current assumptions, you'd be looking at a rather large levy, 16.7 mils. And this is just a math problem here. Each mill generates 12-point-something million a year. You got a deficit. You've got so many collection periods. Spreadsheet just backs into it for us. If you revise the assumptions, we got a little bit better. Now we're down to about 9.2 mils. Still a large levy by our standards, but in my opinion, probably more palatable than 16.7. But again, remember those assumptions. You have to assume that state aid's fully funded, there's no transportation penalty, and then the personnel stays the same, and no capital budget in that assumption. One set of revised assumptions doesn't, we don't stop there. If we can go to the slide, keep going. There we go. Come up with the second set of assumptions. So we left state aid fully funded. That was the rosy picture. Took out the transportation penalty, another rosy picture. But we reduced our cost. We said, nope, let's go back to 1%, and let's don't bring any of the ESSER positions over, and we're going to continue to not fund capital. This is, I think, Eric, is this your Pollyanna? This is what Eric referred to as our Pollyanna example, just for sensitivity purposes. So if you go to the next slide, you can see the three lines. The blue line is our original assumption, what cash balances do. The orange line is the first set of revisions, and then we get incrementally just a little bit better with that Pollyanna to revise assumptions number 2, a little bit better. If we go on to the next slide, you can see the impact then on balances and the levy. Now we've worked this down to about 7.2 mils. Again, you know, let's do what we can to minimize millage, but you have to change these assumptions, and you have to be comfortable with those changes and assumptions. Again, remember, very macro level. We've not gotten down to, because next Tuesday is when I go to Cabinet. Dr. Dixon just informed me in the hallway that I'm coming to Cabinet next Tuesday to talk to the group. But we'll begin to spill this down into a much more micro level. What's this really mean in terms of our behavior and our budgets at a more micro level? But we're just at the very macro level. So there's the impact there. Well, we didn't stop with 2 revisions of assumptions. Please go to the next slide. Our revision number 3. We go back to state aid as not being fully funded. And yep, the transportation penalty is going to be in there of some sort. We put $15 million in. Yes, 2.5 is a reasonable assumption, especially since we're getting to levy planning. And since I've been told that we would want to and intend to bring the 88 back, we put them in. The only thing that's different than our original assumption is I took capital budgeting out. You don't fund capital budget this way. You're going to make the statement that, nope, we're not going to do it in general fund. We're going to do it elsewhere. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see where are we now? And we've added the yellow line. It's not as rosy as Pollyanna. It's not as bad as the original. You take out capital, you improve a little bit. If you recall years ago, I came up with this term. Nobody seems to like it, but I still think it's pretty applicable. This is my hurricane map. Somewhere on there is Tampa, and somewhere else on there is Naples. We don't know where it's coming to land, but it's based upon what model you pick. What set of assumptions do you want to do? And you literally, this is a forecast. You can make whatever assumptions you want to make. And when we get there, this is 1 year where changing these assumptions will have an immediate impact on our behavior, and I'll get to that in a minute. So go on to the next slide, and you'll see how does this impact millage. So at the end, that taking the capital budget of $40 million a year out gets you down to 12.5 mils. Interestingly enough, that's 4.5 mils. I guess I shouldn't, but I do. I think you really need a 4.7 mil PI levy. This bears it out. That's the impact. So either fund it with a PI levy and save your millage here, but no matter what, in order to fund capital, you're going to be in that 4.7 mil levy somewhere. It's got a left pocket, right pocket kind of thing. All right. So my last couple of slides, please. Next slide. Decision points for you, or discussion points. I need your feedback. What do you want to assume about state aid? How do you feel about my assumptions for personnel? What do you want to do with capital budget? We go to the next slide. While these aren't critical to the preparation of this forecast, they are critical over the next 6 to 12 months in our discussions about the financial future. Operating levy. When and how much? And is there a preconceived notion of a maximum millage you're willing to put on the ballot? And that's a internal, external, many people discussion. Capital funding, as you know, what do you want to do? And then staffing, and this is more of a longer discussion about that. How many are over there and how many need to come over? Can we net zero fund them? In other words, will attrition over here in general fund simply be replaced? Do we have people over here that if somebody over here leaves us, we can move them over and replace it, not hire over here? Can we net zero fund? I don't know the answer to that question because I don't know who's leaving and I don't know what these positions are specifically, all right? But that's one option. If not, if you bring them over, this picture gets worse. We delayed, I shouldn't say delay the question, this discussion. This discussion was not had because we wanted to see how the programs work. We wanted to see effectiveness. So we're not going to make a commitment to keep, not going to make a commitment to eliminate. But we know we had to make a decision by the end of fiscal 24. You back up from that because of all the personnel actions that have to take. You know, Article 211 occurs like in January. That's for the next school year. So you've got to have this, you know, you got to talk ahead of time about this. This is really important. Is this 5-year staffing plan still valid? We think it is. You know, that's what's in there. And you know, one of the things we see on a month-to-month basis, we see some variances where we run under plan. And I believe that, you know, we're all looking for teachers, we're looking for bus drivers. My plan typically assumes that all the positions that I paid for last year are fully filled and active this year. Well, if they're not, then we're not spending the dollars, so we can get some variations there. Is that a major impact? No, but it is a factor. So I will say this in closing. One, I believe you need to tell me to change my assumptions because fiscal 25 is negative. And in a fiscal year where you have a negative balance, I cannot sign long-term contracts. Most importantly, some collective bargaining agreements. And we can talk about, well, it's kind of in, but is it in? Can you go ahead and sign the agreement because it's in? Well, because it's in, it runs us negative. Well, which part of all of these expenditures runs us negative? Who knows? But you can change your assumptions. And I don't want to say that you can just make up whatever you want in the forecast. What you have to do is understand what these variables are, their impact, and what is your reasonable feeling about what the future will hold. How much are you going to trust or rely on the goodwill of the General Assembly and change your assumptions about state aid? What's reasonable to assume, because all wage increases are subject to negotiations, just because you put in 2.5 doesn't mean that's where you land. That was always my concern. I mean, I was around when forecasts first were developed, and I was very concerned about putting in wage increases that weren't negotiated. I originally was of the position, and I argued for a long time. You remember Mike, our controller? I worked with his father, who was at the Auditor of State's office, and so when forecasts came out, he went to districts and talked about how you do a forecast and what's in there. And he and I were, I guess, adversaries. I argued zeros because they didn't want to negotiate in public. He argued that that was unrealistic. 40 years later or 35 years later or whatever it is, I've come around to saying, yeah, we're not negotiating in public because we're just not. Just because it's in the forecast doesn't mean that's where you land. Could be more, could be less. And a more realistic picture is something greater than back in the day when I started with zeros. And I moved a whopping 1%. And now I think it's inappropriate now. So that's why I put this in. So it's critical, I think, we make some adjustments. I gave you that table. You can pick those two variables in isolation, and they would be additive if you wanted to do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. They are additive, and I can run those for you. I'm done. That's it. I'm more than welcome to answer questions and hear your input. Remember, you've got next meeting, and so that's a whole nother week. More discussion outside and inside of the board meeting, and sometime after next board meeting, I need to pull it together because we've got to write the notes and get it to you for the second board meeting in November to adopt. And again, the behavioral impact of this is simply when that negative balance comes to fruition. The rest of it is just a picture of where the trends are taking us and what we need to discuss about what we're going to do. Heretofore, I try to always answer the financial issue with revenue issues, revenue generation. Because expense answers mean, to me, kind of program reductions. Or when I say programs, operational reductions too. And we can talk about where school district, that's a whole new, I wanted to avoid expenditure reductions and focus more on revenue. We're at a point where we may be in a combo platter, but it's just a point of discussion. But the critical thing here is pick something. I'm asking you, pick something so we can get 25 positive. 26 is going to be negative. You don't have a solution here. 26 is going to be negative. All right, I'm done. I'm sorry.
We'll start with Chair Cole from the Finance Committee.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for the presentation, Mr. Treasurer. You spelled it out clearly. Here's a few things. One is the committee's discussion, I think, was a very rich and robust one. It was one where they sought in their feedback to us to be conservative, but at the same time to have us thinking about and planning for what we know we need. So conservative to the effect of assuming that there may not be, increased funding by the state, first and foremost. Secondly, understanding that we knew we needed to be conservatively at the 2.5%. That does not take into account the possibilities of increased inflation. That doesn't even talk about inflation, period. That was just an arbitrary number. But we're thinking, and I'm certainly thinking in my role as chair and board member, about what the impact of inflation and a possible recession may be as early as next month or January that we need to consider. The other piece is the 88 carryover, understanding that that is absolutely critical for us. And it is critical for us to maintain capacity for our buildings and staff that we need to keep our buildings and grounds together. So we know we need that to maintain our operations and, in fact, grow towards capacity in that space. So they, again, leaned on the idea of being conservative, but at the same time, not walking back from what they know we need. I just wanted to make sure I framed that appropriately. Outside of that, if there are any additional questions.
And Chair Cole, the committee did indicate that they felt it was important to make a commitment to capital budget funding.
That's correct. Thank you.
Maybe not at, and maybe Board Member Brown might have been the one that said maybe not at 40. If you look at my chart, you could put 20 in and 25 goes positive and 26 is negative. So you go as high as 20. And again, this is a plan. We're not going to immediately go out and act on it because that's really what's being added in 24. 2023, though, because we're already in it, it's kind of baked in the cake, is 23. And just one other, how this all ties together is you can adopt this forecast, and then we take this 23 number and put it into our spending plan for our monthly reports and update it because we were using May. We'll update the 23 with this 23. And then our monthly reports are really an indicator of how we're doing relative to the forecast. And so you'll see things run over, run under, and you just want direction in that particular case. We are becoming more favorable, which is good. We're becoming more unfavorable, which would indicate, it's not good for the forecast. So we're getting direction when we do the monthly reports. So, but I wanted to mention the capital piece because I think Board Member Brown had pointed that out.
Yeah, he and Jordan, he and Mr. Jordan.
Yes, and I would have mentioned that if you hadn't, so thank you.
Sure.
I think that is a particularly important thing that we address. And I know how I feel. It's what I've advocated since I first came on this board. We made a nice start, and we just have to continue so that we're not having operating monies compete for those capital dollars. I thought the discussion at the Finance Committee was really good and helpful. I think that for whatever reason, as I've now listened to this for the second time, I think the picture is less rosy. I think between when I heard it the first time and now, I think that it just is going to be a big challenge. The assumptions, we discussed at length. We now need to have all of you weigh in on those assumptions. I'm not very optimistic about what the state legislature is going to do in the foreseeable future. And as a result, I can't imagine that we'll get to full funding. It's hard. I think we may need to rethink where we've been for decades about what that maximum that can go on the ballot is. However it's broken up, whether it's, PI and operating and what we do at the same time. And I think I'm correct that this forecast doesn't include doing anything with respect to our facilities master plan.
That is correct.
And the next phase. That, yes, it's represented by bond, ? But, none of this takes into account what we've committed to doing with facilities. And that's going to be a big piece. So from my perspective, and I think the committee would be the same place, we've got to start looking at this and thinking about some numbers and rethinking the assumptions sooner rather than later. 24 is going to be here before we know it. And, I don't see a rosy picture here.
And when you say 24 is going to be here, we often refer to the fiscal year as the last year, so maybe it's helped that that's 23, 24.
Yeah.
Because we're in 22, 23 right now. So it's 23, 24 is a year, it's 12 months from now.
But you and your team have done a great job in assembling this, and I really appreciate it. And by going beyond, here's a forecast, but showing the various assumptions and how altering them can affect things, it's a very helpful tool. So thank you.
And I'm not to take any board members' time, but I always end with what are the risks to this forecast? And it's the state, it's collective bargaining, and it's the economy of the state of Ohio, all that kind of stuff. Those risks still exist. But since FAC, which was 2 weeks ago, we've learned that as they've updated our formula for last year's special ed transportation costs, and because of changes in routing there to try and get kids to school on time and move them around, we moved regular ed, and I won't do this justice. If you want to know exactly how it works, you have to talk with the transportation people. But in essence, some special ed kids went to regular buses and regular kids went to special ed buses, and you only get reimbursed if the bus has 51% or more special ed. Well, that dropped. So we went from 10 to 12 million in expenses to like 1.2. So we just lost $3.6 million in special ed transportation reimbursement for this year. We just learned that in the last couple of weeks since the FAC meeting. And then my legislative consultant behind me brought me more good news that reading in Gonwer, there's some movement, some work being done at the legislative level by the state teachers retirement system to contemplate increasing the employer's contribution to retirement. We currently fund that at 14% for both STRS, state teachers retirement, and SERS, school employees retirement, covers our entire workforce. So we're contributing 14%. They're thinking about asking for an increase. Don't know what that is, but an increase is obviously going to drive our costs up. So there are challenges out there, and this will change on us every week almost, it seems. And I'll keep you apprised of those. But we just have to take a deep breath. We got to take a snapshot. We'll put this together, and then we move on. One thing I can tell you is all these numbers will change. That's the only thing for certain. So we'll work through this.
Questions, comments for Stan? We clearly are not done with this. This was a lot to take in tonight, and there will be more discussion next week, and offline discussions as well with Stan. Rebecca Beckerly.
When you talk to your colleagues around the state, especially in the Big 8, are they having a similar?
Yeah.
So
similar issue in terms of the questions about what do you do with state funding. I talked to one colleague and they said we're gonna flat fund, but I don't think they're facing declining enrollment like we are. We dug down into that variable and made those changes. Most of our conversations around what do you assume for state aid.
But so their picture isn't necessarily as.
Oh, I think since May, everybody's picture has changed.
Well, it's changed, but maybe
worse.
I'm thinking they don't necessarily. Maybe they don't have the PI problem, and maybe then they don't. Well, they might have the transportation problem.
Yeah, the PI problem. You're correct. We really didn't talk about that. What we were looking at was where your cash balance is going, and we talked millage impact. And I threw out a number of 12, and a colleague of mine said, "Yeah, we're looking at 7 or 8." I mean, it just varies. Everybody has cringed about the most recent, assessment of where we are in funding and expenses. I have been, quite frankly, asked by my colleagues when we approved our labor agreements. They said to me, what are you going to do when 85% of your budget is now increasing instead of 4% to maybe 6 or 7%? That's what are you doing? And my biggest answer was, I don't know yet. I got to go to my board and talk. We got to talk that through.
And I only ask that because we keep talking about how we should try to gather ourselves, and try to exert more political pressure at the State House and be, strategic, and maybe this is going to force us to start reaching out to our colleagues and the PTAs and literally the labor should be with us too. Our our CEA, everyone should be in the same. So maybe this is a moment. One more thing to do. But that's because one of the assumptions that isn't there is how much does fully funding alone change these curves, or even like half funding, even if it didn't do the full funding, but it funded more than stayed flat.
We assumed full funding in one of these.
Right. But was that the only thing that changed? I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out, though. How much does that drive it?
Oh, I did not isolate that, but we can do that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I might call you up and go through some of those.
I'm looking forward to it.
There you are. You always are. You're always so happy to hear from me.
The beauty of it is that we have the capability to do that. I'm really excited about how the model has grown over time. And, we have I mentioned Matt earlier. He's believe it or not, you find somebody that's really excited about digging into all of that and figuring out what happened at the state level, what variables drove what, and dig way down in there and then create a model so that we can say, what if it is fully funded? What if this does that? I can remember when Excel spreadsheets first came out. They weren't called Excel spreadsheets, but when spreadsheet analysis first came out, and I think it was Hewlett-Packard that had a television advertisement about their computers in this product, and it was just the tagline was "What if?" with a question mark. Hence the phrase "What if analysis." I'm pretty sure I attribute it to the right company, and that's what we can do. What if? So, ask me the question, "What if?"
Okay.
And we'll run it for you.
I think I know the answer, though. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, thank you for this. The clarity is really incredibly appreciated.
Yeah, it definitely provides a very realistic picture of where we are in this very moment. All of the things discussed in the budget are essential things that are necessary for our children to have the educational experience this community has said that we want. And when we hear things like, well, you, the school district, have to fund it, or you have to do it. No, let's be clear. We are funded by our taxpayers. We fund it as a community. And if we want our children to have excellent teachers, state-of-the-art buildings, rigorous curriculum, it costs money. Period. And for a long time, public education has been torn down and continues to be torn down the street, or up the street. Now we're south, aren't we? Up the street in the heart of downtown Columbus. And that's the story you've heard. The legislature cutting the ability for us to get tax funding, fining us for things we have no control over, changing formulas, maybe not funding formulas. All of that hurts our students, our children. And so we have to make a commitment, Columbus community, that as we move forward over these next fiscal years, as we come to you with PI, with buildings on FMP, and operations to fund the salaries of the teachers and staff at the levels that they deserve, we need your help. We need your commitment, because it's our children that are on the line, and that is serious. It is serious, and the board takes it very seriously. And our treasurer does a great job, and he has shown us a lot of different things with the forecast, places that we can be more conservative, places that we can look at to try to get to, getting us above zero. But in the end, it's not about that. It's about giving our children the things that they need to be successful, and we are literally talking about basic educational essentials. And so I just, as the board members work through this, and we're going to have more discussion, much more detailed, and we're going to bring ideas back to Stan during the next board meeting. I just want to make sure that we are all presently minded in what it is we are doing when we talk about this. So thank you, Stan and team. You guys do a great job. Thank you to our finance committee that did have a very robust discussion. Their expertise is, so appreciated. And thank you, board members, for your work that you're about to do in this so that we can have a great discussion
It's
next
good
week.
to see that you understand that I asked you questions and they're to be answered. It was funny, we were ending the finance committee and they were like ready to leave and I went, no. I asked you a question. I want an answer, and they kind of went, oh, you really do want our input. And yes, I do. It's your forecast. Let me know what you think.
All right, board members, you have homework. We will talk more about this next week. Thank you, Stan.
You're welcome.
Okay, we have added item 7.1 in our board matters agenda for a brief update on our voucher litigation. I'll turn it over to board member Brown.
Thank you, and if I could, not only is the financial picture not rosy, but when you look at all across the board at what the legislature is doing and what people in the legislature and groups outside the legislature, there are many that are intent on destroying public education, period. When you look across the board. And this, what I'm going to mention in a moment, is part of that picture. This is about the Ed Choice voucher program that we sued back at the front end of this year. But there's a legislation pending to expand this even further to all students across the state, the backpack bill. Anyway, this arose now because just this morning and this afternoon, I attended in person a hearing at the Franklin County Common Pleas Court before Judge Jiza Page, who's handling this large, complex lawsuit that we and quite a few other school districts filed against the state. The state filed motion to dismiss, as it would normally do. And then there were two interveners. The judge has allowed them to participate, not because it's required, but just because she likes having all the information possible. She does a very good job, and yet she's a complete poker face. Watching her on the bench, and she didn't have questions for any of these lawyers. There were, 4 sets of lawyers. She didn't give anything away in terms of what her thinking. The 2 interveners also filed motions to dismiss and motions for judgment on the pleadings, which basically means that assuming everything is right, assuming everything we have alleged is true, they're saying that we still can't win because the law doesn't get us there, even if we assume everything we've alleged is right. And the state's argument today focused a lot on whether we have standing to sue, whether school boards have the capacity to file a lawsuit of this nature. State is very well represented, as are the interveners, but listened to about an hour and a half of oral argument by the 4 teams of lawyers. The arguments were essentially technical because they were about these questions. Assuming everything's true, what does the law say about that? Because if we can't get there on, in that situation. It was, they also talked about, well, I said we're the wrong people to sue. Interestingly, the state lawyer, Todd Marty from the Attorney General's office, talked extensively about the cost of this litigation. All public cost that the public is paying through school district dollars to the coalition for, litigating this, that the state of Ohio is defending this and it costs the state money there, and then the judge and her staff itself and the justice system costs money. I think it was not a good argument, but he went overboard on it. The important thing is that there is continuing a stay on discovery so that nobody's spinning their wheels and gathering documents and spending money on that yet, but that will occur after the motion is decided. My best guess is that she'll decide in a month or 2. And they do a very thorough job with this kind of work here. Also related is that the coalition is up to about 140 members, and about 85 of those are school districts that are directly supporting and actively funding the litigation. There's a strong effort to increase that number, and I think we may have some thoughts about how we can help here in Central Ohio. So if anybody has questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you for that update. Sure. All right, we're going to now move into our consent agenda. This evening, our consent agenda consists of items 9.1 to 24.10. Any member may request an item be removed. Are there any items to be removed for separate consideration? Seeing none, is there a motion to approve our consent agenda?
Moved.
Second. There's a motion and a second. Are there any items the board member would like to discuss? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Ms. Beckerly?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cole?
Yes.
Vice President Reyes.
Yes.
Ms. Vera.
Yes.
President Adair.
Yes.
Motion carried.
Thank you. All right, we're going to now move into the portion of our agenda for public comment on non-agenda items. We are going to move to our, we're going to have Ms. Cheryl Elliott. Please come up, and as you're walking up, you will have 3 minutes to address the board. The board will not ask questions. We are just here to listen to you and hear your comments. You are here to talk to us about transportation for Summit Academy Community and Middle School. Your action requested is have transportation provided for all my students and hear my concerning story about transportation. You may begin whenever you are ready, Ms. Elliott.
Thank you, and good evening. My name is Cheryl Elliott. I'm the principal of Summit Academy Community and Middle School, and I've been extremely honored to be in education for over 20 years, and I spent the last 15 years working with special education students at Summit Academy. That's what brings me here today is my students, to advocate on their behalf and the behalf of their families who have experienced job loss, who have had the inability to properly manage their health care and other hardships due to the lack of adequate busing for my students. Last week, we completed our first quarter of the school year, and my students do not have sufficient busing at this time. Most don't even have routes assigned to them. Those who do arrive an hour late to school every day. Some of them leave as early as 2, or they have to stay until their parents are off work as late as 5 o'clock. And that has forced me to provide school care until the parents get off work. These students are missing critical components of their curriculum that address their special needs, and that's why they come to Summit Academy. We have a program that starts in the morning. It's a 30-minute restorative circle that addresses the social emotional learning of my students, and it's a unique program to our school, and they're missing that. Likewise, my elementary school students who leave early because their parents can't pick them up on time are missing writing every day, and that's just crucial and unacceptable that they're missing the instruction. Our parents have reported the issues to Columbus City Schools as often as daily with no response or resolution. I have been one of those that has filed complaints weekly with the Department of Education. I've had the news media to my school, and nothing has changed. One of our parents has an elementary student and a middle school student that comes to my school. One of them is allowed to ride the bus and the other is not, and that just doesn't make sense. We know that the pandemic has set us, the students, behind academically, and coming out of the pandemic with the inadequate school bus transportation has set them even more behind. And it has created great hardship for my parents who often don't have the means or the ability to pick their students up. And so I'm here tonight to let you know that my busing situation is very poor. I have almost 30 students. Half my students require busing. Right now I have 8 that get a bus in the morning. They don't get a bus home, and I only have 2 students that get a bus home. So I thank you for your time. I know it's late, but I appreciate you listening to me.
Thank you for coming to address the board and sharing your concerns. Our next speaker is Sue Brennan. Topic, bus transportation. Action, improve the process for transporting our students. Good evening, Ms. Brennan. You have 3 minutes to address the board. You may begin when you're ready.
Thank you. My name is Sue Brennan, and I am the school director of Columbus Collegiate Academy, Maine, one of 4 high-performing community schools in the United Schools Network. Like many of the community schools in Columbus, our families rely on CCS for transportation. I'm here today to share the story of Janera, an 8th grade student at my school. This is her 3rd year at CCA Maine. She came to us reading at a kindergarten level. With a lot of hard work in her 6th and 7th grade year, she blossomed into a reader. She was so proud of her progress and confident that in her 8th grade year, she continued to grow. This school year, Janera, who is a returning student, was not assigned a bus route until after the start of the school year. Now that she has a bus stop, there are new problems. Her bus route is often uncovered, and it does not come to pick her up. When Janera does not make it to school, when she does make it to school, her evening route is also uncovered. She waits at school until 5, 6, sometimes 7 p.m. until a bus arrives to take her home. You can probably guess that Genera's progress has failed. Everyone in this room is here for the same fundamental reason. We know that the students of Columbus, students like Genera, deserve a high-quality education. We know that a gap exists between many of our students and the students who live elsewhere in Central Ohio, and we all want to close that gap. We know that this is a gap of opportunity, of the resources students need to make academic progress and fully realize the potential of education in their lives. One of these resources is transportation. At CCA Main Street, we have at least one uncovered bus route in the morning and oftentimes 2 or 3. We've also had at least one uncovered afternoon bus every single day after school. Only one of our 4 buses comes to pick students up during dismissal. Some students wait hours until a bus takes them home. When students cannot get to school and access their education, the opportunity gap widens. When a staff member must supervise students into the evening instead of preparing for the next day, that gap widens. Many of our families do not have the resources to drive their students to and from school. We offered to close that gap for them by providing transportation, which is a promise that we cannot uphold without your partnership. We understand the challenges that you face and know they will not be solved immediately. However, we should be able to expect consistent communication from you. We should be able to expect that you will return our calls and answer our emails. Be available to respond to the concerns of our family who reach out to you, and inform our families if there is an issue with transportation. Finally, I ask you to consider the impact of uncovered buses to a student like Genera. The gap that she works so hard to close will persist every day that she is unable to come to school or return home on time. Please address this issue with urgency and gravity that the students of Columbus deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. The next thing on our agenda is executive session. Vice President Reyes.
I move that the Board of Education recess into executive session per section 121.22 G1 of the Ohio Revised Code to consider the appointment, employment, or compensation of public employees, and per section 121.22 G4 to prepare for, conduct, or review negotiations or bargaining sessions with public employees concerning their compensation or other terms and conditions of their employment.
It's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cole?
Yes.
Vice President Reyes?
Yes.
Ms. Vera?
Yes.
President Adair?
Yes.
Ms. Beckerly?
Yes.
That motion carried.
Thank you. We will now recess into executive session. We will return to this room to adjourn our meeting, but that will not be televised. So thank you to the staff who are in attendance and all of you who are watching. Have a great evening.